Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 81. Opening Communications. There was a flicker, a pause of absolute darkness, and the impression of people speaking no nightmare visions, no pain. What I felt was almost mundane, and then nothing. I was sitting in my chamber with a vague feeling of something having happened but no idea what. I wasn't sure what I expected, a personality index, a Voigtkampf test, maybe a brief eldritch horror episode. The knowledge that something had happened but that I had no idea what was new and disturbing in its own right. Still, I suppose it didn't ultimately matter. Beside me, Henry gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. Time was moving again. That made me feel a little better, and I started taking stock of my interface. Thankfully my mana had refreshed. Unfortunately, nothing else had changed. My store was still unusable. Overall I felt underwhelmed and a little scared by everything that had happened. I'd come to expect that prompts meant something fairly serious was going to happen. Yet even when I checked my alignment, I found the same odd runes. Looking at them, I didn't feel pain or disorientation. I was starting to suspect they were an error text or a placeholder. Well, my mana refreshed. So that's something, I said, then sighed. It looked like I was in for another day of deconstructing items, which suited me fine. Now that I had a reason to think things would improve, it wasn't a situation that filled me with anxiety. Good. How are you feeling? Henry asked. He'd scooted closer now that we were alone again. Better now, I said honestly. I rested my head on his shoulder. It probably would have hurt if I had normal sensation levels. He was literally just bone. Instead, with my limited tactile sense, I just found it comforting. Feel up to a walk? I kind of want to get the hang of my wobbly baby deer legs, I said. I felt an urge to do something other than being a lump. Resting for a full day hadn't made me feel better. It was time to try something else. As you wish, Henry said, standing up. He helped me to my feet, which wasn't a quick process. I could form and hold legs without an issue, but getting them to work was a different matter. They were kind of bendy and elastic if I didn't focus, more like a split version of my tail. Not an ideal support system. Henry was a champ about helping me along as we made our way to the necropolis. By the time we reached it, I'd halfway mastered walking. I even managed a little dignity as we passed through the bleachers and into the main area. We settled at a table and played a few board games. I had agreed with Henry about sending out a text about what happened initially. But, thinking about it more, I had concluded that being seen would help more in the long run. I wasn't at my best, but I was alive and unharmed in any meaningful way, something the skeletons could confirm with their own jewels now. My plan seemed to work as more skeletons than usual made a point to detour over for a visit. That I'd also taken the liberty of pulling out a new game to draw them over shamelessly might also have had something to do with it. Either way, I soon was chatting about what I intended to do with the girls and the farm with various denizens. It felt kind of nice to talk to everyone, a few people at a time. The halflings, as usual, were more chatty. They didn't hesitate to let me know they'd be interested in living outdoors if there was an opportunity. The genuine surprise for the day was when the humans offered me feedback. None of it was shocking content-wise, just ideas about necropolis improvements. It was still very much the first time for them to come forward like that. Feeling kind of sorry for the girls in the safe zone, I included a pack of playing cards and some paper and pencils as a care package around lunchtime. Hello. I'm 42, the core of this dungeon. Given that you entered under the influence of a mind control item, I'm inclined to offer you a deal to leave safely. If you are interested in discussing the matter, please respond on this or one of the provided pieces of paper. Thank you. 42. I didn't have a lot of hope for them to want to communicate yet, but I figured sending a note wouldn't hurt. They'd ignored the food I'd left them the prior evening. To be fair, they still had some of their rations left. They didn't look appetizing to me, but they likely felt safer about eating things they'd brought in themselves. I couldn't fault them for that. Once I started to feel social burnout, Henry helped me back to my chamber of machinations. I was tempted to teleport instead of walk but decided against it. Nevertheless, the activity wasn't physically draining and gave me something to do other than wallow. After I was able to flop back on my couch, I felt myself relax a bit. That was also when it struck me that Henry had been looking after me for 2 days. That had to have been a pretty terrible combination of tedious and nerve-wracking. You know, I'm feeling pretty okay now. It wouldn't hurt for you to work on your projects while I work on mine, I offered. I'm fine, Henry replied flatly. All right, but feel free to cuddle up with a book. I'm just going to spend my time deconstructing things again, I said, not wanting to push. Cuddle? Henry asked, tilting his head slightly. Like when? Easier to show than tell, I muttered the last half. I turned my back and settled in against Henry in my preferred configuration. My head resting against his chest with his arm draped over mine. I thought you meant for me to leave, Henry said softly. I didn't intend to but let out a snort at that. That meaning to the configuration of my words had not occurred to me. Nope, I like you right where you are, I replied. Henry made a pleasant humming sound, and we sat like that for a few minutes. This would have been an excellent moment to start a certain conversation. But, unfortunately, I wasn't up to it. Not with things still so uncertain with the server transfer. Needing to get myself back on task, I returned to my busy work. Everything I hadn't gotten to the previous day went in the deconstruction tab. While the timers were going, I worked on low-effort art projects. Drafts of rating team logos went out for revision and approval as I sought to kill time. Around what I assumed would be a good dinner time, I checked back in on Andrea and Mina. The deck of cards was untouched, along with the food I'd left. No surprises there. Feeling a bit mischievous, I added a checkers set to the room and a pair of upgraded bedrolls. The bedrolls were variations Alim had found, and I'd upgraded. Not as nice as his, but plenty comfortable. Curious if they'd even bothered to read my note, I checked the paper I'd left. I found a reply to my message. Fuck you. I couldn't help but laugh. I hadn't expected them to reply, so even this felt like a bit of a win. Chapter 82. Earthly Awkwardness. After my amusement with Mina and Andrea's reply to my message died down, I found I was ready to make at least one crucial decision. I would let Myra and Heta wake up in the morning. Putting it off much longer would cause complications. The rub was I would prefer to keep Myra and Heta in the valley for a bit longer. Still, that was something I didn't want to accomplish by trapping them. Doing things in such a hostile manner would invite problems. Greetings. Your companions have descended into a dungeon, and 2 have died, Reiner and Lillian. Mina and Andrea are still alive but, at present, are trapped. But, like yourselves, they are now free of the enslavement items. I will see if I can free them, but I make no promises. If you remain on the farm, I will inform you of the outcome. If you choose to leave, I won't blame you. You may use anything on the property and take what you want with you. The valley is safe to explore, but do not enter the mine. If you wish to ask me questions, write them on the supplied paper and pin it to the door. I will retrieve it during the night. -42. I was going for mysterious hermit with this, but I feel like I overshot it into Creeper Town, I said as I showed Henry the letter I'd written. I planned to leave it for Myra and Heta to find on the kitchen table. That Henry was looking at me with unabashed confusion took a few moments to sink in. Right, slang. That thing that didn't translate so well. By Creeper Town, I meant I would frighten rather than intrigue them with what I wrote, I explained. Henry nodded, looking thoughtful. The way you con Henry started, then made a frustrated noise. A moment later, I got a text notice. The way you construct metaphors is foreign but poetic. Is it common practice where you're from? I felt my orbs flicker. Using constructing metaphors to describe garbage that usually came out of my mouth felt a little too fancy. It's not anything grand, just slang. It's hardly poetry, I admitted. Henry shook his head at that. I have trouble understanding it sometimes, but it is relatively clear in context. Which is more than I can say for most poetry. Henry would have been grinning if he had soft tissue. I knew it even before I read the message. Between the two of us, I suspect you're the one hiding poetic depths, I said and laughed. I'd never heard Henry recite any, but it was in the way he moved when fighting, how embroidery seemed to flow like magic on fabric he touched, how those same hands managed to guide artless me through the steps of an unfamiliar dance. Maybe I'd never hear it, but I'd already seen and felt it. You think too much of me, Henry said flatly. I was taken aback by the unexpected harshness as much as the clarity. It wasn't like he stumbled over every single word, but it wasn't often that he got off a whole thought cleanly. When he did, I'd noticed it was when he felt something intensely. You know, I've been wondering. It seems like you have a harder time talking around me than the others. Am I making you uncomfortable? I asked. My looks might not bother him, but he might have been pushing himself to an uncomfortable degree in comforting me. Not everyone was a cuddler. And no. And no, not at damn it all. Henry growled. It was rare that he uttered a curse of any kind. That he could say it clearly while other words failed him was kind of hilarious, but I was consumed with sympathy. When all else failed, swearing would always be there for you. Like a totally useless friend who never helped. If he were still fleshy, I'd say all his brain blood fled south. Uppens to aw man when you rap about like a snake in heat, Chris offered gleefully from the door. I sat up in surprise. Henry stood, giving off crackling sparks of blue energy in his rage. He promptly face-planted as neither of us had noticed my tail wrapped around his legs. I was fairly sure that if a DM could blush, I would be. Furiously. I quickly retracted the offending appendage. Chris howled with laughter as he took off running. Henry stood up rather slowly, then turned to me and bowed. Pardon me, 42, Henry said tightly. I just nodded. This would not end well. Henry disappeared in a flash of blue energy, moving at top speed. Given that it was his class's focus, it was an impressive display, to say the least. Chris had a lead, but I was pretty sure he wouldn't even last half a minute. Not unless Henry drew it out intentionally or took his time dismantling the foul-mouthed rogue. I was truly glad I'd set the auto-respawn feature on all the skeletons. I also suspected if it were possible to simply murder one of them hard enough to make the second death stick, Henry was in the mood to do it. I had started a call with Aaron when I got the respawn notice for Chris. I'd have lost my chips if I'd bet on the matter. It had taken Henry 45 seconds to hunt him down in the end. So, nothing complex this time. Break the spell but don't specifically wake them up right then. They can get up on their own whenever they happen to in the morning, I finished explaining. I'd been fine until the notice popped up, then lost the ability to make eye contact, my embarrassment returning with a vengeance. Very well. I'll text you the details of what I intend to do. As requested, Aaron said cautiously. Thank you, I said simply and ended the call. A few minutes later, I got what was probably an insultingly broken down and simplified explanation of how Aaron would undo his spell. I immediately dubbed it magic for dumbasses and felt relieved he'd taken me seriously. Mainly because despite the gratuitous amount of explanation, I still ended up with several questions and kind of lost in the middle. Without shame, I quickly wrote out what I hadn't understood and texted him back. I did indicate he was good to go despite that, however. My lack of comprehension wasn't severe enough to warrant a delay or aborting of the plan. I finished that and worked on a few minor tasks, nothing important, which was my version of fidgeting. Finally, when I glanced over at the door for the 100th time, I found Henry loitering in the entrance to my chamber. Hey, I said like an idiot. 42, Henry replied. I'd expected and somewhat dreaded his return but had thought it would be sooner. Instead, it had been nearly a half hour. Looking Henry over, I realized he'd changed his shirt. The first one had been black with an intricate embroidered pattern that wasn't visible unless you were close or the light caught it just right. This one was similar in style but without the embroidery. Instead, the front was pleated on both sides of the button placket. The pleats were narrow, a half-inch in depth at a guesstimate, and knife straight. Looking carefully, I noticed Henry had also added a brooch of sorts. It was a blue rose just over the chest pocket. The outfit felt a little more understated than the other one but still very nice. Unfortunately, I couldn't place the reason for the change, which had me wrong-footed for a few beats. Care to join me? I asked, gesturing at the couch. As if he hadn't moved past needing an invitation weeks ago. Henry nodded in reply and sat down a full cushion away from me. This was officially awkward. So wait, is that a nick? I asked, spotting a tiny gouge in the bone of Henry's chin. It was definitely a new one. He hadn't been in a raid league match for a week. What? Henry asked in confusion. He barely had time to react as I scooted over, taking hold of his jaw. It was definitely a nick, straight-edged too. Thumb on it, I drew a line with my pointer and found a corresponding feeling on his chest under the shirt. Chris had struck deep enough to leave a mark in the bone. You changed your shirt because Chris got you, I said in shock. And not seriously. Henry said defensively. I growled in irritation, grabbing the hem of his shirt and pulling it up. The slash would have run from his chin on his right to a handspan under his armpit on the left. It might not have been lethal, but it would still have been a hell of a wound on living beings. 42. Henry said sharply, fighting to pull the hem down. Realizing what I'd done, I let go and thrust my hands behind my back. Like hiding them was helpful or sensible. Sorry. I said, wanting to kick myself. Henry didn't know what cuddling was. Plenty of the denizens were put off by mere hugs. I didn't even want to know how many lines I'd likely just crossed. See, Chris lacks discipline, but he is proficient. I apologize for the poor sh showing on my part. I was rather emotional, Henry said mildly. Poor showing? Henry, I was just worried about you. I know you don't get injured like a mortal, but that's still my instinctive reaction, I explained. You were worried about me? Henry asked like it was a foreign concept. Obviously, I said and chuckled, relieved he wasn't upset. I felt like this was an excellent moment to apologize again for the breach of etiquette, modesty, or whatever pulling up a man's shirt would be called. I went mute when I noticed Henry was leaning in toward me, jewels a little dim in a mellow kind of way. I was about to ask him what he was doing when an alert chime distracted me. System update. Your new alignment is chaotic neutral. Congratulations or condolences as appropriate. Your server reassignment will commence immediately. My interface wasn't in share mode, and Henry leaned in through the prompt to kiss me. The world blurred into a colorful smear, and I had no idea if that was the effect of the server transfer or the kiss. Chapter 83. Immortal Folly. Even though I should have been focused on the server transfer, I didn't care. What was happening between Henry and I had my full attention. Every other sensible thing I should have been worried about was just white noise. Neither of us had to come up for air, so it went on for quite a while. We only pulled back minimally from each other to try something different or say something briefly. My weird physical state brought it to an end as I eventually grew too tired to keep going. Is this okay? Am I making you feel claustrophobic? I asked. We'd been cuddling for a bit. Or at least my version of that, which was more like tangling myself oddly with and around Henry. He answered by pulling me more tightly to him and kissing my hair. I couldn't help a laugh. I felt kind of fuzzy but relaxed in a pleasant way. I laughed again when I realized what I was doing would probably look kind of fucked up to an outside observer. More like a flesh-eating shadow clutching the skeleton of its victim than cuddles. I was okay with that. With my head resting on Henry's chest, I noticed something kind of odd. There was a kind of faint humming. It wasn't like the wet thrumming of a pulse, but it had an ebb and flow to it all the same. Curious, I shuffled around a bit, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Henry inquired, sounding amused. I replied. Oddly enough, it ended up being strongest where a human heart would be. I slipped a hand inside Henry's ribcage, his undone shirt making it easy. 42 ha! Henry laughed, and I felt something sort of fuzzy though there wasn't anything visible. It was strange, but a couple of things I'd read clicked into place along with some of Aaron's magic lessons. I think I can sense the mana animating you, I said, looking up at Henry. Well, apparently it's ticklish, Henry said. I wiggled my fingers and got another laugh before I withdrew my hand. It was interesting, but I wanted to understand what was happening better before messing around too much. The last thing I would want to do was hurt Henry by accident. How are you feeling? Henry asked gently. Still tired. Hopefully, I'll feel more normal when the transfer happens, I said. That was when it occurred to me I'd forgotten about the notice. My orbs flickered as I shook off my indulgent haze and looked at my interface properly. It was the same as before, but I noticed a small marble under my system clock. A drop-down opened, revealing a timer labeled transfer. It looked like it would finish just before today's reset. That should happen today at reset, I said aloud for Henry's benefit. He hummed pleasantly in reply. One or both of us should have been responsible and started getting to the day's tasks. Me specifically, but Henry was distracting me. I chose not to do anything about it. I could chuck stuff in my upgrade panel without moving from my spot. My interface didn't care where I worked from. So really, I could do pretty much everything aside from walkthroughs and environmental sculpting. Things that could wait until I had access to my store again. Ahem, the sound startled me into a half-sitting position. Henry rose up too, looking toward the door. Dawn stood leaning against the door frame, clearly amused. Henry made a noise like a strangle squawk and hastily pulled his shirt closed. I had to fight not to laugh. Most skeletons still walked around with little to no clothing. Dawn was dressed in something like a sari with pants, though, so maybe that added an awkwardness to it. How can I help you? I asked, feeling oddly exposed. It occurred to me that I was, in fact, not wearing anything myself. It was something that didn't matter but felt a little more significant than usual. At least, considering how I was tangled with Henry. I came to see how you were feeling, mistress. I'm guessing rather good right now, Dawn said merrily. Yep, now I was feeling the awkward. I'm great, thanks. I should be all better tonight. The system issue will resolve before refresh, I said hastily. I was doing my best to unwind myself from around Henry without making it too obvious. That and avoiding accidentally throwing him on the floor. With some teamwork, Henry and I managed to sit up in a more appropriate manner. However, I wasn't sure if our scramble to try and look decent made things better or worse. I see. Well, I'll let everyone know the good news, Dawn said, and I could sense a shit-eating grin. She gave a respectful nod and left with a spring in her step. She left in a hurry. Am I being paranoid, or is she about to collect on bets? I asked Henry. Dawn seemed a little too eager to leave after barely poking any fun. I should hope not, Henry muttered darkly. Didn't bet on yourself? I asked teasingly. No. Henry texted me, looking away uncomfortably. It definitely hadn't landed as intended. Not if it bothered Henry to the point where he couldn't respond verbally. I was kidding, Henry. It's kind of a thing where I'm to tell others not to bet against you as a display of confidence, I explained. Dawn will speak of what she saw if you don't instruct her otherwise. I felt my orbs flicker. That blunt statement took a couple of seconds to sink in properly. Oh. If you're embarrassed, I'll tell her not to, I offered a bit weakly. Henry had reacted pretty strongly to getting caught, but I hadn't really considered that it might be about more than that. He'd kissed me, but it was possible he didn't want that known or was regretting it. I felt a sick little shiver at that thought. Embarrassed? Henry asked as if he'd never heard the word before. Of you? Henry asked. I cringed, not sure what to say. Henry laughed, and I half jumped out of my skin. It didn't last long, just a loud bark and softer chuckles quickly fading. Henry got off the couch and knelt in front of me, taking my hand as he did. I let him, numb with confusion. I thought you would be embarrassed of me. How could someone as unworthy as I dare feel that way about you? With that text, I felt myself relax a little. I knew exactly how to feel about that as a concept pissed off. Henry, if I was embarrassed by you, then I'd be the unworthy one, I said flatly. You say that without knowing me as I was. I say that knowing you as you've chosen to be since you arrived here, I shot back. Henry stood, seeming flustered. I felt a different kind of unease than before as I looked at him. We hadn't really talked about his past outside of a few random facts. I honestly didn't care, but that didn't mean it didn't still have its ugly hooks in him. I'd seen his stats. His stutter wasn't a physiological problem. I was an assassin, Henry said flatly. I was surprised but not entirely because of the reveal. He'd had 4 levels of warrior and 1 of rogue to start with. Based on that, I hadn't assumed he was a former assassin, but it wasn't that hard to believe. Henry was exceptionally good at finding weak points in other skeletons' fighting styles. During the Kingslayer Rebellion, I asked without thinking. I knew almost nothing about that event, just a few names and locations. I only knew that much because Chris kept asking me to make books about one of its historical figures. The Grave Man. An assassin with a kind of Zorro flair to him. I only thought of him now because of how badly Henry had reacted to the mention of him before. I had to wonder if they'd been rivals of some kind. Henry visibly wilted and my heart dropped. Before I could say anything, he took off in a blur of blue. I stood up, hand outstretched as if I could stop him. The sudden move left me dizzy, and I fell back on the couch after tottering unsteadily. I felt completely at sea as I tried to understand how things had gone from lovely to this. Chapter 84, Odd Circumstance and a Choice. When Heta awoke, she found herself feeling oddly comfortable. It hadn't been that long since the party was dragging her through the desert. Not a place where those who were naturally furred and intended for cooler weather ever chose to travel. Without thinking, Heta rolled her neck only to cringe in anticipation of a shock. Nothing happened, and her hand went to her neck, expecting but not finding cold iron. Myra, wake up, Heta said, calmly shaking her lover. What? Myra asked, voice thick and eyes blurry with sleep. I need you to slap me so I know I'm not dreaming, Heta said. Hey? What's the dream about? Myra asked as she sat up. She was not an early riser by choice, and the recent trip had been challenging for her. Seers didn't usually travel, and the decay of her eyesight was well underway. My collar is gone, Heta said, still not willing to believe it. One hand was sliding up and down her neck as if it would simply appear again. She'd been wearing it since the chaining 3 years prior when everything had gone to absolute chaos in Stromholt. Can't be. No one was here but us, and there's no dead body laying about, Myra responded. The hands of the dead will remove the collar, she added, reciting her oracle on the point. They'd both witnessed others who'd tried to unlock slave collars struck dead in the attempt, collar still firmly in place at the end. The curse on the thing was one of the significant hurdles to either of them getting free. In a rare moment of clarity, Mina had suggested they use a corpse's hands to try and unlock it. Unfortunately, while she remained more lucid than the others, Myra couldn't act freely long enough to attempt any such thing. Wait, so if I'm free, then I can. Heta reached over and stuffed her hand down the front of Myra's shirt. Myra raised an eyebrow in confusion but didn't try to stop her. I think we have more pressing things to worry about, Bun, Myra said, nonplussed about suddenly being groped. You're not wearing the pendant, Heta said, eyes wide. That her collar was missing felt surreal, unbelievable. That Myra was free of the pendant had Heta's heart beating in excited rhythm. That's not. Myra patted her chest down and felt around her neck, searching for the familiar and dreadful lightweight of the pendant. It was gone from around her neck. Oh, thank you, La, Myra said. She hugged Heta, and they sat silently for a few minutes, enjoying the strange knowledge that they were free. Unfortunately, Heta was the sort to count a gift horse's teeth, so the moment ended rather abruptly. I don't understand, Heta said flatly, pinching herself and then Myra. Myra squawked in protest but then realized she was, in fact, unquestionably awake. That didn't stop her from pinching Heta right back. Neither do I. Let's take a look around and see if there are any clues, Myra said simply. She could have attempted an oracle on the point but decided against it. It was always better to investigate a matter first rather than jump straight to divine intervention. Eula was an understanding god in most respects but didn't like being overused. After spending an hour searching the farmhouse for clues, they didn't manage to turn up anything. Nothing looked like it had been disturbed. They both were bothered by it but didn't have the luxury of dwelling. They quickly packed their belongings and got ready to leave. Abandoning the party had been their plan in the first place. They both wanted to get as much distance between themselves and the heroes as possible. When they stepped out to leave was when they finally found a clue. Or, more precisely, a partial explanation. Greetings. Your companions have descended into a dungeon, and 2 have died, Reiner and Lillian. Mina and Andrea are still alive but, at present, are trapped. But, like yourselves, they are now free of the enslavement items. I will see if I can free them, but I make no promises. If you remain on the farm, I will inform you of the outcome. If you choose to leave, I won't blame you. You may use anything on the property and take what you want with you. The valley is safe to explore, but do not enter the mine. If you wish to ask me questions, write them on the supplied paper and pin it to the door. I will retrieve it during the night. -42. What? Heta asked as she read for a second time. The handwriting was just large enough to be legible to Myra in the late morning light, so she hadn't had to read aloud. This 42 has to have taken the enslavement items off of us. I say we stay, Myra said after a few minutes of contemplation. What if it's a lie and Reiner's alive? Heta asked. What would be the point of that? None of the party has the brains for a scheme like this right now. So whoever 42 is, they have no cause to lie, at least not in a way that leads to no benefit, Myra said. Heta didn't have a good answer for possible motive but didn't relent. Her ears drooped as she struggled for something more convincing than vague paranoia. If he is, you're immune to the sword's curse. So put him out of his misery, Myra said without any particular hesitation. Myra. Heta said sharply. Myra just looked at her steadily until she dropped her eyes. She'd trained Reiner with the bow at the Oracle's tower for years. Treated him like a younger brother before he'd been selected as the chosen hero the year before the chaining. I don't say it out of malice. I know it's not his choice, but that's what makes it merciful. You've seen him struggle. He's still in there and aware but helpless, Myra explained, putting an arm around Heta comfortingly. I know, it's just. Heta broke off, pulling away from Myra. She'd been a guard of the tower, a role that required a bit of bloodshed every now and then. Unfortunately, that hadn't prepared her for the anguish of agreeing to Myra's plan. Letting the party go into the dungeon without her was a death sentence. Heta was the group's backbone in combat, able to move freely and fight using her true skill. The single advantage of being chained with the collar instead of a pendant was freedom of thought. I know, Bun, Myra said gently. Heta was accustomed to being a defender. Myra, in turn, had been raised only to see. Unfortunately, that had often included visions of the darker side of people's nature. No matter how simple a request for an oracle might seem on the surface, there was no telling what Eula would show Myra. Children murdering parents for inheritances, the acts of soldiers against civilians, and suffering in all its various forms were familiar to her. The god would show her the answer, no matter how gruesome, once asked. "We can go if you want. I won't lie, I'm not keen on traveling the desert so soon, but I understand," Myra added. They'd been invited to take what they wanted from the farm, and she felt that it was a true statement. They'd be able to provision themselves comfortably. Thinking of comfort, Myra felt a minor pang of regret at the idea of leaving. They wouldn't be able to take the absurdly comfortable bed with them. It would be a shame in her book not to have Heta on it at least once. "No, we'll stay," Heta said finally. "Good," Myra said simply, leaning against Heta to rest her head on her shoulder. It was the first time they could be together properly in years. Despite everything going on and the strangeness of it, she was thankful for at least one quiet day. Heta rested her head against Myra's, enjoying the moment. She had a habit of being slightly paranoid, but she didn't break the sweet atmosphere this time. "You're a horny little goblin, and you should be ashamed of yourself," Heta said without malice when Myra grabbed her ass. They both started laughing in relief with a slightly frantic edge to it. It still didn't feel real, but they were properly free. Much later, they pinned a reply to the door. Chapter 85. Space. In the wake of the turmoil, I was not in a good place. In a slightly less fraught situation, I'd have probably texted Henry and asked to talk to him. Given the possibility of compelling him against his will in doing so, I just wrote 15 drafts and deleted all of them. They were getting weirder with every new attempt to make them as neutral as possible. As evening fell, I checked on the farm to see if I'd gotten a reply from Mina and Heta. I was rewarded with a piece of paper pinned to the door. "Hello 42. I'm Myra, a seer of the Oracle Tower of Western Strom. My companion is Heta. Our gratitude to you for liberating us from the items enslaving us goes beyond words. If we can be of service to you, you need only ask. We will stay in the valley for the time being and hope to meet you so we might express our thanks in person. With all our gratitude. Myra and Heta." The very polite note made me feel a little more at ease. I wasn't sure what exactly I was going to do, but this gave me time to figure it out. With refresh and the server transfers complete fast approaching, I made up my mind about something else. "Henry. I don't know why you're upset, but I respect that you are. How we go about this is up to you, but I'd like to understand what's going on. When, if ever, you feel like talking, I'll listen." -42. I wrote out finally. Short and simple. Definitely an improvement compared with some of the multi-paragraph ramblings I'd composed earlier in the day. Not tagging on that I missed Henry took actual effort. It was true, but the sentiment felt manipulative at the moment. That did nothing to quell the roiling anxiety I felt about what I'd written coming off too impersonal. After our earlier, whatever it was painfully easy to imagine him taking it the wrong way. That he wouldn't understand how I cared and wanted things to work out between us. I hit send before I could second-guess myself into further choice paralysis. With that done, I only had one practical concern left to deal with. I blocked off the forest side entry to the dungeon. The valley one was technically at more risk while I was potentially incapacitated by whatever was about to happen, but better guarded. Myra and Heta weren't likely to try their luck in the dungeon, and new enemies would have to traverse the stone maze. That would buy me a couple days to recover from whatever I was about to go through. As an experiment, I also blocked off the primary entrance in the valley. I hadn't tried this since connecting the forest side with a thin band of surface purchases. I was relieved to find it didn't put the dungeon into a build alarm state. It seemed like the small entrance accessible through my lookout spot was enough to satisfy the need for an accessible path to the core. With everything meaningful I could accomplish done, I laid on my couch and waited for the transfer timer to run its course. Not an easy wait, but since I wasn't sure what would happen, I didn't want to be working on anything. 42. Henry called from the entry chamber. I looked up in surprise. There was less than a minute left on the timer. Henry, I started, not sure what to say. This was not an ideal moment to start a conversation. Henry walked over and handed me a letter. My server transfer is about to start, I explained, switching to share mode so he could see the timer. He just nodded, offering me his hand as he sat down. I took it as I quickly stashed the letter in my inventory. When the transfer timer hit 0, everything shimmered like heat haze. There wasn't a feeling to it per se, but a sound like a rain stick full of broken glass. Runes flashed and fade, disorienting but less severely than the prior times. It took a moment for me to realize I could remember the times I'd first integrated with my core and upgrade sickness now. As that hit me, so too did the memory of what exactly had happened in my moments of missing time. Kings played chess on fine green silk with the fates of thousands or a single life riding on the game. Neither knew what would happen, only that the patterns of fate would wend around their play. Neither cared, the game long since losing its savor. They carried out the motions, fucking a dead horse in hopes of the memory of pleasure. The world bled and pulsed, and I knew there were too many eyes. The flash of my prior experience merged seamlessly into the blind madness of the new. I wasn't assailed by visions but by sensation. Sinew, bone, and blood. The wet grinding horror of my human body rang in my ears with each unneeded breath. Flesh on the tips of my fingers felt a burning cold as needles danced across my skin. I was complete. What was, what is, and what might yet be, tangled and thrashing. The journey isn't the destination, but I'll grant you a wish in exchange, a voice whispered in my ear. I grasped blindly for it. I found void, bone, fire, and flesh writhing in my grasp. The promise would be kept, but only if I slew myself and returned whole. The answer and the question were the root. I woke up from the experience clawing at the ground with my throat aching. The unfamiliar pain was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was that I was on my back with a pair of skeletons looking down at me. Dawn and Chris. I shifted and realized I was being held. Henry, he'd come just before the transfer started and had remained. I felt relief and let myself melt into his embrace. Thankfully not quite literally, but I definitely relaxed. Hey, I said, throat protesting my attempt at speech. How are you feeling? Dawn asked in concern. Fine-ish, I offered. Chris just rolled his jewels at that. You were screamin' and thrashin' for like hours, Chris growled. Like he was talking to a child too dumb to know how bad its lies sounded. A few minutes, Henry corrected. Oh. Well, I don't feel any pain now. Not more than I was earlier anyway, I explained. I still felt like a wet rag instead of my usual floaty self, but that was all. Especially since I'd foregone the use of my mouth to communicate that time. I was also losing some of the details of what had happened during the transfer. Like a dream, it wasn't fixed in my memory and I was fine with that. I wasn't sure if that was good or bad and just accepted that it was happening. I checked my interface and let out a sigh. The entire thing was grayed out and full of incomprehensible runes. I'd been hoping to get access to my store back, not end up even more deeply screwed. A moment, please, Henry said. Dawn nodded in understanding while Chris just crossed his arms, not going to budge. Henry and Chris locked in a staring contest, Chris's glare a clear challenge. I didn't want them to fight, but before I could say anything Dawn grabbed Chris by his neck and just started dragging him. Fuck! Chris hissed as he scrabbled like a puppy caught by the scruff. Dawn was a couple inches taller than him, but I hadn't really thought much about it before. Now it occurred to me that her skeleton was larger than others in the dungeon. If she were fleshy she'd probably have been pretty scary size-wise. I knew she also had a higher strength than most but couldn't recall the exact value. "What's wrong?" Henry asked me gently once we were alone. "I'm just processing things," I said, half honestly. I'd taken my interface out of share mode so no one had seen what was wrong with it earlier. I didn't know enough about what had gone wrong to say anything meaningful and was too tired to have a freak out about it yet. "Ah, well," Henry trailed off, pulling me closer and kissing my hair. A message alert dinged as a prop appeared. "Server transfer complete. Final reintegration with core commencing." A loading bar started ramping up toward 100%. When it filled, a wave of pain and weirdness shivered through my body. Like a flashback to my upgrade experience that hit like a jolt of electricity and disappeared in the same instance. There was no bizarre vision, but I felt like I'd seen some IT dude wave cheerfully at me while it happened. Really, that was pretty fucking weird in its own right if I let myself think about it more than I probably should. Much like how said IT guy had seemed familiar. Looking through my interface, I found it changed but comprehensible and responsive again. I felt a thrill of joy as I bought a tile just to prove to myself that it was in fact working again. "Oh, thank fuck. Everything's working again," I said in relief. "I had suspected," Henry replied, amused. I looked at him in confusion, then realized I was looking down at him despite the fact that he was standing. I had started hovering again and my body felt basically normal. "Yes!" I shouted in glee. I spiraled around him, drawing him into my twisting inhuman swoops of joy. Chapter 86. Equilibrium. With my system restored, I spent quite a bit of time looking through it. My new alignment, chaotic neutral, was quite pleasing to see. It certainly fit how I planned to behave better than chaotic evil had. One of the most significant changes I found was in the content of my store. The range of monsters open to me had increased significantly, and a variety of new magic items were available. Between the two, I was more interested in the items. It seemed like using Duello's boon had influenced things. The items were all sound and communication related. Glyphs that could be imprinted on objects to create sounds, linked devices like walkie-talkies, even a few that record and playback sound like magic cassettes. I immediately bought a couple of the playback items and sent them to the bards. They would get quite the kick out of those. However, once I was done playing with that, I realized I'd neglected to check my communications interface and contacts. Agony and Steve were still gray. A bummer, but I found everything else in working order, thankfully. Selecting Henry as a test subject, I was surprised to find a new option to contact him, video call. That might be fun to play with, but I closed it for the moment. Henry was sitting on the couch, sipping a chaos beverage and watching me placidly. Despite our earlier argument, he seemed much calmer now. He hadn't even tried to rush me to read his letter, encouraging me to finish looking things over first. I was genuinely grateful for him being understanding on the point. However, as much as I was enjoying the process, it was still underlined by anxiety. Until I did a thorough examination, I wouldn't know everything was truly alright and couldn't fully relax. Looking through my contacts list a second time, I realized that I'd missed something. Stephen and Agony were grayed out, but a new icon had appeared, the friend invite option. I'd added people before, and my monsters auto-populated my contacts, but this was slightly different. Selecting it, I found that I had the option to invite Myra, Heta, and Alim's mother. They were people I hadn't met in person and couldn't access a system profile for. I was very tempted to do just that for a moment. But, in the end, I thought better of it. Alim's mom was unquestionably off-limits without his express consent, and I wasn't going to ask. His concerns about my intentions toward Tiller did not suggest it would build trust for me to ask for increased access to anyone he cared about. Myra and Heta were still tempting, but I decided against it for slightly different reasons. I'd already established a communication method with them. Changing to using the system might scare them or raise new questions I wasn't ready to answer. My relationship with them, such as it was still new and very fragile. I feel like I'm missing something, I said morosely as I sat on the couch. I'd started hovering again, but it seemed like I had better control than before. I was able to seat myself instead of floating slightly above it, a nice change of pace, in my opinion. Well, perhaps, Henry said, pointing. Pointing turned to a poke as he nudged my lips with his finger. What? I asked, not catching on. Why you've changed a bit, Henry said wryly. I felt my orbs flicker. I'd forgotten the recent addition to my face for a minute. After a moment of embarrassment, I nodded. I should take a look even if it didn't feel like the new addition to my anatomy was that important in the grand scheme of things. With a sigh, I added a mundane full-length mirror to the wall across from the couch. Then, getting up and heading over, I examined my mouth visually for the first time. It was definitely the stuff of nightmares, a maw full of carnivorous black teeth. The interior tissue was primarily black. However, on the ribbed flesh, there were highlights of dark green. My tongue was dark green with hints of lighter color. It seemed normally proportioned despite being pointed. Like a little kid, I tried to touch the tip of my nose. To my surprise, it reached up without a problem. Fully extended, it was inhuman in design, long and tapering to a thin point. I had to lean in pretty close and use a light stone to see all of that. Like with the rest of my body, my mouth would be invisible from a distance except in silhouette. Even up close, someone would probably only get a vague impression of wrongness, only the vaguest suggestion of torn flesh and teeth. I think the mouth is the only change, I said with a sigh. I'd given myself a cursory feel up to check. Unless I was missing something visual, I hadn't felt anything new. No second set of arms or spikes had appeared. I agreed, Henry offered, clearing the throat he didn't have and looking away. I almost said something but froze. I realized that he'd done his own investigation not too long ago, a rather thorough one at that. Well, I suppose it's an aesthetic improvement to have a mouth now. Can't say how I feel about it looks-wise, though, I offered awkwardly. How I felt about myself wasn't something I spent a lot of time thinking about. Usually, if I was concerned with aesthetics, it was about one of my projects. Honestly, the skeletons were a lot more expressive regarding personal style and aesthetics than I was. They chose to wear or not wear clothes, and I'd noticed a few of them adding what looked like scrimshaw to their bones. When it came to myself, I couldn't say much. It might have been a holdover from the lack of personal memories, but I wasn't sure. I did a lot of design work, so I felt like I had preferences in that respect. I just couldn't say I had a favorite color or a hated one when it came to myself. I like it, Henry offered. I could hear a grin in his voice and felt the acidic tingle of a blush at that one. However, I kept on with my examination rather than dignifying that with a response. I guess I kind of like green. I muttered to myself. My orbs were an attractive color, I felt. They were green toward the bottom, where the heart of a candle would be. The paler outer edges were a brighter, almost electric shade. I decided to consider green my favorite color until I felt strongly about another. I decided to leave the mirror in place and went back to the couch with my inspection done. It was about time I got to my normally scheduled dungeon tasks. I wasn't seriously behind yet, but there was no reason to put off buying tiles I could. This all feels surreal, but it's nice to get back to work, I said to Henry. Indeed. I have a few projects I should work on as well, Henry added, getting up. I was a little surprised but didn't feel disappointed. After what happened earlier, it was probably best that we both had some time apart. At least until I read the letter. My only regret was not telling Henry how much I appreciated him coming back before the transfer was completed. It might not have hurt to do it, but I felt nervous. Accidentally triggering another blow-up would be more than I could deal with at the moment. All right, hope I get to see them soon, I offered sincerely. It was always fun to see what Henry cooked up for himself and others. You will, Henry assured me. He executed a charming bow, and I couldn't help laughing. He seemed pleased with that, and I realized he was trying to cheer me up. It worked despite everything going on. Once Henry left, I took a couple of minutes to decompress. I had lots to do, and sorting out my priorities was the first step, something best done with my mind solely on the task. I considered reviewing the Hero Party raid, but decided against it. It would need to be done soon, but it wasn't a high priority. I needed to build out the stub layers first. Fine-tuning based on the raid could come after that. Not that I had high hopes about what I'd learn from the group. They'd been under mind control and fighting suboptimally because of it. So they were hardly an ideal control group for a test. A message notice chimed while I was working. Seeing it was from Alim, I decided to take a short break and read it right away. His health was good, and the title didn't indicate urgency, but I like to be prompt. Mistress 42. I considered your advice and told Tiller about you. She would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Alim. I read the clipped wording of the note twice and felt a shiver of foreboding. I hoped I was being paranoid, but this did not feel like it was going to be a friendly chat. Chapter 87. Questionable Priorities. I considered how I wanted to handle Tiller and groaned. There wasn't exactly an ideal solution to the situation I found myself in with her. We needed to talk now that she was aware of me, but I didn't like the tone of Alim's text. That really could have been my social anxiety talking, though. Or what I assumed was social anxiety. Unfortunately, I didn't really have enough exposure to novel people and situations to know for sure. Alim. I'll call you in the morning since it's rather late now. However, since I don't sleep, feel free to contact me first. -42. My reply was a bit lackluster, but it was what I could do. It wouldn't improve things to ruminate on it too long and let myself get twisted up in my own head. With my basic chores completed, I considered my next step. I had decided to read Henry's letter once I was done with everything else I should do first. Partly to give me some time to find a little zen, but mainly so I could focus on it entirely once I began. I opened my event log and found the timestamps for the hero raid. My point counter had ticked up already, but I was curious about the details of the award. Unfortunately, the math didn't quite track from what I was seeing since it was 15/50ths for my tithe count. With only 2 people dead, I was reasonably sure the maximum should have been 8 points. That meant that even with the rollover from the prior year, it should have been 11/50ths at most. Death Report. Reiner, LG, +4. Lillian, LG, +4. Bonus Award, Minor Champions of Stronghold +4. The bonus award was new to me. It must not have applied to ordinary folks like soldiers and bandits. I took a look in the encyclopedia and my manual but couldn't find anything about the champion's designation. I felt a bit annoyed with the interface for the manual, wishing it was a physical book as I poked the screen. As if someone, maybe that IT guy, heard me, it turned into one bound in black leather and promptly hit the floor. I half jumped out of my skin, ended up floating a few yards above the couch. Once I settled down and was back at my normal hover level, I picked up the book. It felt nice to have something to physically thumb through, so I took my time looking through it. I quickly found that it had gained a lot more content once again. Another series of editions of dubious use since they were all jumbled up in random places like someone had hastily crammed it in. I was curious what would happen now that it was physical, but the option to edit popped up like it did with the Windows version. That opened the PDF style editor, but the book didn't dissipate. Instead, the physical book was updated in real time as well. I found that pretty fun and added a fancy illustrated initial letter to the first chapter. Despite my amusement, I didn't spend more than a half hour playing with the book. I still had something quite a bit more important to consider. That being, if I was going to spend any points. With 15 points at my disposal, a mana production upgrade was an option. Increasing my daily mana output would unquestionably be helpful. It would give me a great deal of flexibility with what I could do day to day. In addition, it would relieve some of the tension from having to be careful about the timing of my spending. I wouldn't have to worry as much lest I get caught with my proverbial pants down in an emergency. The logic behind choosing it was sound, but I still hesitated. Nuking 2/3 of my points wasn't something I was exceptionally comfortable doing. Not with how I had no idea when the next set of adventures of heroes might happen. If anything, I felt like it might be worthwhile to spend a couple of points upgrading my interface instead. I was on a new server that was at least partially under new management. I might get something pretty cool, and it was a lot cheaper last time. Upgrade interface several times, I said aloud. Interface upgrade. Cost, 3 PTS. Confirm upgrade? Y/N. Everything looked pretty straightforward, but I hesitated to activate it. I'd experienced upgrade sickness before, and that wasn't something I wanted anyone to walk in on by accident. Hello. Minor update. I'll be indisposed for about an hour while I perform an upgrade. Feel free to contact me in the next half hour before I start if you have any questions or concerns. Thanks. 42. I sent it to the skeletons who'd shown an interest in knowing details during the 24 incident. Don and Chris were chief among them. Aaron was also on the list, but not due to concern for my well-being. I knew he'd just want details about any runes I saw or other magic shenanigans. I didn't send a copy of it to Henry. It was a little too impersonal. Henry. I'm going to spend some points and upgrade my interface. I've done it before, and it was safe. I feel like that will be true this time as well since the server transfer is complete. Being under the umbrella of neutrality instead of evil gives me a lot more confidence than I would have otherwise after recent events. Feel free to come over or just text me if you have questions, but I expect this will go just fine. I plan to start in half an hour, but I haven't read your letter yet. I plan to do it after. I'll get in touch with you afterward. Until then. 42. It took all of 2 minutes for Henry and Don to write me back. Like a coward, I opened Don's first. Mistress 42. I understand and hope you gain useful new abilities. Also, did I cause a problem? Henry has been either sulking or positively murderous all day. I had honestly expected not to see him. That or he'd be scattering rose petals and dripping honey from his lips given what I last saw you two doing. Don. I laughed, unable to do anything else. It was just like Don, to be completely blunt about it. Not that I minded. Getting caught making out like a couple of teenagers really shouldn't have been as big a deal as it turned into. Hey Don. No, you didn't cause one. Henry and I are okay. Things are just a little awkward. We skipped the get to know you part of things and are paying for it with interest now. So please do me a favor and try to keep everyone off his back for the moment. Well, I mostly mean Chris, but you probably knew that. Thank you. 42. With that reply done, I didn't have any viable reason to delay opening Henry's. 42. I was quite upset earlier and feel I gave you the wrong impression. However, my regard toward you has not diminished. I still fear that the contents of the letter will alter your view of me, but not quite so melodramatically as I suggested at the time. I'm glad you're feeling confident about the upgrade. Still, please don't hesitate to ask if you would like me to be near while it happens. If not, then I will remain in my workshop and keep you in my thoughts. I am always wishing you good health and fair fortunes. With my fondest regards. Henry. The letter was almost painfully sweet despite not being overly flowery. It was the kind of letter that belonged in a box for great-grandkids or historians to find and puzzle over. Recalling the manual's transformation, I gave the screen a hopeful poke. I was rewarded with the letter turning into paper. I immediately put it in my inventory. I'd make a box for it, and hopefully future ones, later. Henry. Your presence never fails to comfort me. Really, I would like to see you now, but I feel it's best to wait until after. Thank you for being understanding, and you are in my thoughts as well. -42. I didn't feel my reply was up to the same standard but brushed that off. The thought would have to count. I was an artist, not a poet. With my replies done, I waited a while for the time limit I'd set to elapse. Once it did, I gave it an extra 10 minutes before locking my door. Looking at the door to my chamber of machinations, I felt a little uneasy. I didn't really expect trouble, but it didn't feel like a sufficient barrier. Not with Chris lurking about. As a compromise, I added a block of stone in front of it on my side. It wouldn't be possible to open it even if someone got past the lock. It wasn't like Chris would do anything to me even if he did. I was a little worried about how he'd react if he saw me in the throes of upgrade sickness. He'd been pretty on edge since the 24 incident. With all of the most likely issues sorted out, I okayed the interface upgrade. A 15-second timer appeared, and I let out a sigh. It wasn't long, but time really had a way of crawling when you weren't looking forward to something. As the timer neared 0, I heard a familiar chime. An incoming call from Alim. I'd been so wrapped up in dungeon matters that I'd forgotten to send him a text about my plan. Oh fuck was all I'd managed to get out before upgrade sickness slammed down on me. Chapter 88. Communication issues. A day's travel out from Sultan and his family, Alim was lying in his bedroll, unable to sleep. He'd tried to call 42 to no avail. A turn of events he found mildly worrying. She'd said she would be available. Alim let out a sigh, wondering if he were being paranoid. It might have just been a bad moment to call. He usually texted her, so he didn't really know when it was or wasn't a good time. The call hadn't really had a purpose if Alim were being honest. He had plenty of things to discuss with 42, but none of it was on his mind. Really, he just wanted someone to talk to. Across the fire from Alim, Tiller was asleep or pretending to be, her back turned to him. Storm, her foul-mouthed bird, took notice of him looking and fluffed up defensively. He also let out a sound eerily similar to laughter. Alim casually flipped Storm off, which earned another round of the unnerving sound. He felt like he'd taken it well when Tiller had informed him about the hawk being demonic in nature. Unfortunately, he couldn't say the same for her reaction to him being in a contract with 42. Alim sighed, knowing it wasn't fair to Tiller. She wasn't being unreasonable. It was part of why he'd made up his mind not to tell her anything and cut ties. Then he'd bollocksed that up by tossing an empty potion bottle into the woods. He hadn't expected Storm to care, let alone collect it and inform Tiller of what it was. A bitter chuckle bubbled up in Alim's throat, only to die. He was still getting used to the idea that Storm was as intelligent as a person. That the rude creature was also better versed in magic than anyone Alim knew, including army mages, had been a revelation. If Alim had thought he'd end up forced to tell Tiller everything, he'd have handled it differently. He'd have told her sooner, likely before they left Sultan. He really couldn't blame her if she never wanted to speak to him again. "Marlowe, you awake, boy?" Alim asked softly. "Master," Marlowe replied. His eyes glinted with firelight as he emerged from Alim's shadow. "You catch any of what happened earlier?" Alim asked. Tiller had laid into him for being an idiot for what felt like hours, then stopped talking to him outright. She'd only been willing to acknowledge Storm for the rest of the day. "Yes, your mate is rather feisty," Marlowe commented dryly. "Don't call her that," Alim said more sharply than he intended. "As you wish," Marlowe replied. "Sorry, it's just. It's rude to say something like that with humans. At least if you don't know if it's true or not," Alim started to explain. He wanted to talk, felt like he needed to really. Still, he wasn't interested in having Tiller even angrier with him than she already was. Getting labeled his mate, however innocently, would likely do just that. Tiller is my friend, and I care about her, but that isn't the same, Alim continued. Could you not court her? Females of my kind like shiny stones and interesting metals. You could hunt whatever your own like as tribute, Marlowe offered, tilting his head in confusion. As if it were a simple matter to sort out. Females of my kind tend to like those too, Alim offered with a chuckle. That seemed to increase Marlowe's confusion, which made Alim laugh harder. It's not that I can't, it's that. She might not want me to, Alim admitted. He didn't have any such plans but felt an awkward little twist in his guts at the idea. He'd never had many friends. The idea of losing Tiller's friendship left him feeling cold. Would she not inform you? Marlowe asked. How do your females let you know if they don't like it? Alim countered. Usually with their teeth, Marlowe said flatly. That made Alim chuckle. He was rather glad human women didn't do that normally. Have you ever had one? A mate, I mean, Alim asked. No. Mana veins strong enough to support many of my kind aren't common, Marlowe explained. The fire kinds tend to be more numerous. Though, like their own nature, the power they rely on is often fickle. So it's not unusual for them to appear during a great fire only to be snuffed at its conclusion, Marlowe continued as if commenting on the weather. Hey, are there water hounds then? Or air ones? Alim asked. He'd never seen an elemental up close before Marlowe. Even those he glimpsed at a distance were small creatures. The occasional hearth lizard or a bird like zephyr, the same as anyone might see every couple of years. Not that I know of, Marlowe replied without much interest. Tiller shifted, making an uneasy sound. Alim was instantly on alert. Between Storm and Marlowe, they hadn't had to set watches. The only trouble Alim had noticed was the bird's mood tended to plague Tiller in her sleep. Despite his concern when Alim looked up, he found Storm preening without concern. Tiller still fidgeted and mumbled in her sleep, but it seemed to be nothing more than a dream. You've had a mate before. I've seen your pup, Marlowe said, no question in his tone. What of it? Alim asked, hackles rising. I'm curious what you gave her as tribute, Marlowe said simply. Alim felt his stomach twist, then let out a sigh. June was a sore spot, but the hound wasn't asking to be cruel. My wife. June and I didn't exactly court properly, Alim started, laying back down. The words made him feel tired spiritually, but that, unfortunately, didn't make him drowsy. She wasn't healthy, but she wanted a child. So we got married, and I got Bess, Alim summarized. It was as close as he had ever gotten to telling the story to anyone. That June had lied to him about being ill. That she'd been entirely content even as she lay dying because her duty was complete, as she'd put it. What duty exactly and to who had never been clear. Alim only knew it hadn't been to him or Bess. Should you not seek another mate? Marlowe asked. Alim's hand clenched reflexively. June had been odd from the day Alim first met her. Always self-assured in an inexplicable way. Not as if she were confident exactly, but rather like she felt like she knew what would happen. As if everything she did was just getting on with things she knew couldn't be avoided, so there was no need to fuss even if they went poorly. To Alim, the village girls had been lovely, and he'd been interested. June had been a weird anomaly he'd ended up more intrigued by than anything. He hadn't really had a crush on her but had wanted to shake her up a bit. Have a bit of fun showing her that not everything was predictable. Alim rubbed his face ruefully. He'd done a rather spectacular job of that when he'd surprised her by slipping in cow shit trying to sneak up and give her flowers. Somehow she hadn't foreseen him making an arse of himself and was shocked for what she claimed was the first time in years. I wouldn't want to drag someone down with me. I don't think 42 would do it intentionally, but it could easily happen, Alim admitted for the first time. Getting someone twisted up in his questionable choice was different from living with the consequences of it himself. He didn't regret his contract. His mother's life had depended on it. That didn't mean he'd want to endanger Tiller. Letting Tiller speak directly with 42 was actually something Alim hoped would convince her to give up and go on her own. He couldn't see the rather sweet but awkward dungeon master not scaring the shit out of anyone seeing her for the first time. Not to mention the confusing way she talked most of the time. Up in the tree, Storm started squawking, but it wasn't his alarm call. Instead, he sounded curious to Alim's ear. "I have no fucking idea what you're on about," Alim said flatly. He didn't speak demon bird and wasn't going to wake Tiller up over it. "He's asking a rude question," Marlowe informed him. "You speak asshole?" Alim asked in surprise. That got a low chuffing laugh from the hound while Storm squawked indignantly. "Something like that," Marlowe agreed. "What's he asking?" Alim inquired, knowing he probably shouldn't. He couldn't help being curious, though. Marlowe hesitated, but the bird started squawking again, earning a warning growl. "He'll wake his master if I don't tell you, but I'd rather not repeat the corruption that fell from his beak," Marlowe growled. Storm, ever the little shit, fluttered down to land on the stump next to Tiller. He started to take a deep breath like a child about to start a proper screaming fit. "Just tell me." "It'll probably be worse if he has her translate it," Alim said flatly. "He asked why you were willing to take an ill mate and if you didn't care that she would die of the effort of giving birth," Marlowe said quietly. Alim didn't move, the words cutting like a lance of ice through his gut. He'd been too young, dumb, and horny to realize anything was seriously amiss, but he'd never been callous. With the question asked, he found an answer rising like bile for the first time. "I wouldn't have if I knew she was ill, but she lied about it. I could have lived without us having kids," Alim said flatly. Their relationship had been odd, but he'd loved June. Storm laughed and spoke again. Alim looked to Marlowe immediately, wanting to know what was said. "He asked if you see your wife's murder when you look at your pup," Marlowe said reluctantly. "She didn't die in childbirth, and even if she had, that's no sin of the child's," Alim replied. Storm laughed again but stilled when Alim held up a hand to forestall him. "Let me be clear, bird. You fucking talk about my daughter like that again, and I'll find out how you taste spit roasted," Alim said harshly. Storm puffed up, clearly enraged, but a hand around his throat stopped him cold. Tiller was awake and had caught him with a glove too thick for Storm's talons to pierce. "What he fucking said," Tiller growled. Alim was surprised for a moment as Tiller stared down Storm and finally extracted some kind of grudging reply before releasing him. The bird flew back up into the tree, but a higher perch, and visibly sulked. "I'm still pissed at you," Tiller added over her shoulder before laying back down like nothing happened. Alim swallowed reflexively and prayed 42 scared her off. He didn't think he had the heart to do it himself anymore. Chapter 89. In decent haste. I laid on my back on top of a table. Around me, shrouded figures were seated. With utensils of strange design, they prodded and cut at my being. Not to heal, but to feast. All that I was became their nourishment. I hope they fucking choke on it. I felt like garbage for a few moments when I came to, but it passed. The upgrade sickness vision was already evaporating from my mind. Combining the interface upgrades into one had made it worse, though I couldn't have said how now that it was over. I made a mental note not to do that again unless I had a very specific reason. I also realized rather late that I should have checked what I was getting in the upgrade before committing to it. Unfortunately, the system didn't give me any hints about what had changed now that it was done. I resigned myself to hunting the changes down the old-fashioned way. Thankfully it wasn't that hard to do. All of the tabs with upgrades were marked with red triangles with black exclamation points in them. I noticed a red dot on the message icon. Checking in, I was reminded that I'd missed a call from Alim. I swore and went to call him back. It had been half an hour, and I wouldn't blame him for being pissed. Shit, I muttered when Alim didn't pick up. I felt my innards shrivel. Hey Alim. Sorry for missing your call. I was a little tied up at the time. Nothing else should come up. Feel free to call me back at any time if you need to. -42. I sent the text instead of trying again. Alim might have been asleep, and I didn't want to wake him if that was true. He could get back to me when he felt like it. With that mistake fresh on my mind, I remembered the state of my door. I quickly removed the block and unlocked it. Thankfully no one was waiting outside anxiously. Minor fuck-up averted, it seemed. I decided to take things a step further. I sent a text to clarify that things were fine instead of leaving it ambiguous for the dungeon denizens. After recent events, they'd probably appreciate it. Hello. My upgrade is complete, and everything went well. So I've reopened my chamber of machinations and will take calls and texts again. Thanks. -42. I sent it to all of the skeletons I'd messaged earlier before starting on Henry's. Hi Henry. Everything went just fine, and I'm alright. Nothing weird happened this time, thankfully. -42. Once I had my message to Henry sent, I knew it was time to read his letter. This was probably why my brain immediately panic-spasmed and generated a list of other things I could do. It shouldn't have been such a big deal. Still, Henry's trepidation seemed to have rubbed off on me. At least a little bit, anyway. I decided to read it after I gave my interface a once-over. Hunting down my new upgrades was technically more important. I definitely wasn't just stalling. To my surprise, I found the upgrades were marked with red tooltip icons in this version of things. I had one on my monster, crafting, and personal info tab. Since the alert on my personal tab seemed like the oddest one, I decided to check it first. It took a couple of seconds for me to figure out what had changed. Rather than a new field or feature, there was a small paintbrush icon on my personal portrait. I selected it, then let out a shriek of fear. Hovering just in front of me, nearly nose to nose, was a dungeon master. I barely had time to process what I was looking at before I banged up against the ceiling. Below me, the other DM was in the same spot but had weirdly had the same posture and looked freaked out. With something like a wobbling top noise at the wrong pitch ring in my ears, I just stared. Unlike 24, this one had green eyes like me. That didn't do much to make me feel better. The only thing that helped me calm down a little was realizing a new menu was open. I glanced at it and noticed a series of drop-downs followed by fields with sliders. They all had names like species, height, eye color, etc. I was looking at an appearance editor. Feeling like the only thing that had kept me from pissing myself in terror was the weird nature of my anatomy, my embarrassment was profound. I did manage to scrape myself off the ceiling and descend to the floor before anyone saw, thankfully. Floating over, I gave the other DM a solid, for me, slap. It mirrored the gesture, and I couldn't abort fast enough to stop the collision. My hand went through its face, and it passed through mine without even a flicker of feeling. Whatever I was looking at wasn't an entity in its own right, more of a 3D dummy of sorts to test changes out on. At the moment, all of the appearance options were locked. So I couldn't edit how I looked as a DM. The only drop-down I could do anything with revealed a selection of monster races to choose from. I very carefully made sure I didn't select anything. Instead, I read the tooltips to better understand what was going on. It turned out to be less of a chance to change my species and more of a costume option. I'd been a bit worried that I was supposed to pick a final boss persona or something. Of course, it wouldn't grant me new abilities, but it was kind of neat. I promptly closed the appearance editor. With all of the customization options, I could already tell it would be a black hole for my time and attention once I got started. I wasn't going to put off reading Henry's letter for that long. Getting back to my actual task, I checked my crafting tab. I didn't need to be a rocket surgeon to realize I had an extra slot on all of my crafting options. Woot! I said happily, doing a swoopy dance. The appearance option seemed odder than practical, but the crafting slots were plenty useful. I didn't hesitate to put the new slots to use. I always tried to ensure I had all of them going, even if I was just using junk as filler. I might not have a practical use for S-grade common textiles, but by golly, I had them. After the blitz of potion disassembly I'd done when my interface was wonky, I didn't need to process junk. Instead, I had piles of components and formulas to mess around with. With that sorted, I double-checked my crafting interface. I was hoping I'd overlooked something but, alas, I had not. That left my monster tab, and I was burning with curiosity now. I wouldn't have called the other two options duds, but I was hoping for a big win. I found it in the form of a new information card style entry. Enhanced Skeleton, Elemental Firehound, and Giant Mole were all listed like information cards. I was treated to a new interface that offered improvement options when I selected the one for Enhanced Skeletons. After reading through what was available, I immediately zeroed in on an option. Illusion of Life. This ability hides the necromantic status of a creature and grants an illusionary appearance. A minor magical force field is generated around the body to approximate the form of a living creature. It will fool the sense of those who come in contact with it. However, it can be seen through with specific magical abilities and by high-level spellcasters. It would be crazy expensive, a full day's mana, but I wanted it. Despite that, I checked to see if I could buy it for a single skeleton to test it out first. Thankfully, I could, and it was cheap enough that I could squeeze it in. I made a call. I need you to be honest with me. Are you wearing pants right now? I asked, my voice on the border between frantic and elated. The fuck? Yes. Chris responded. Like a dumbass, I accepted his answer and activated the illusion. I could hear gasps and use ring out through the open line. Chris was not wearing pants. Chapter 90. Fruitless. Tiller woke at a touch from Alim to the black of night. A few hours before dawn, if she had to hazard a guess. She looked at Alim expectantly. After the fuss with Storm, he'd said he'd gotten a message from 42 indicating they'd need to find a particular kind of spot to contact her. Alim gestured, and Tiller rolled out of her bedroll to follow him. In the dark, she could hear the whisper of the wind in the trees and the padding of light feet. They weren't alone, but she'd already figured Alim's mysterious companion would be about. She had no idea what it was, just that Storm muttered darkly about the creature. Tiller took her hawk's displeasure as a sign that it was a sweet creature with a gentle temperament. There were few things Storm hated more than likable beasts, the other being cute children. It was probably why he'd tried to pick a fight with Alim over Bess. The journey didn't take long, with Alim in the lead using his strange magic light. Not more than a few minutes, and they were at a forbidding group of trees at the foot of a little hill. I can't get too far away, but I'll try to let you have some privacy, Alim offered, sounding nervous. He gestured at what looked like it could have been a cave. Every hair on the back of Tiller's neck stood on end. She was not a fan of tight spaces or being underground. This has to be in there? Tiller asked as her mouth went dry. She looked at Alim suspiciously, wondering if he'd somehow figured out her discomfort with such places. "'Fraid so," Alim replied. He looked a little perplexed by her hesitance, so Tiller figured it was just bad luck. She fought down a frustrated sigh and started to walk forward. This was the ribbon on her dogshit week as far as she was concerned. "Tiller, you okay?" Alim asked, sounding worried. Tiller nodded as she didn't trust her mouth to construct the lie believably. Oddly enough, darkness was her friend as she stepped in and found she couldn't see a damned thing. The cave hadn't looked that big when she was coming forward, but even holding out her arms, she couldn't touch the sides. "How far in do I need to go?" Tiller asked. "You're fine where you are," a feminine voice replied. Tiller nearly jumped out of her skin. It was soft and kind of raspy with a weird layering. Like two people talking together but a little out of sync. She'd never heard anything like it before. In front of her, a small pair of green lights bobbed and began to grow larger. They didn't precisely brighten as they did, but the larger they became, the more she could start to make out a shadowy suggestion of a face. Hello. I take it you're Mistress 42, Tiller managed as her guts tightened. The lights were some kind of green fire pouring from the sockets where eyes would be on another creature. She wasn't sure why or how, but something changed subtly. She could make out a suggestion of a body to go with the face. Lithe, feminine, and smoke-like, it loomed above her. Correct, and please, just 42 will do, 42 replied. Tiller nodded, catching a flash of black teeth in a mouth she really didn't want to think about. Now, Alim mentioned you want to speak with me. Did you have questions about something? 42 asked. Her tone was almost congenial despite her voice being ill-suited to it. Tiller was reasonably proud she wasn't pissing herself and managed another nod. Alim said he cut a deal with you to save his mother's life, Tiller started. Alim hadn't told her willingly. She'd had to drag it out of him, but he'd told her in the end. Like with most things, he was just utterly, uselessly stubborn about it. He did. He's agreed to trade time in my service for the potions I gave him, plus ongoing payment for the duration of our contract, 42 supplied without missing a beat. Is there a way for him to get out of that? Like if he paid you back or I took his place, Tiller asked flatly. Tiller. Alim cut in. Tiller just rolled her eyes, already expecting his offer of privacy to be a lie. He hadn't wanted her to talk to 42. There had never been a chance he'd let her do so without listening in. No, 42 replied. Mistress, this is why I didn't want this to happen, Alim said sharply. Then maybe you should have explained things better, Tiller shot back venomously. That ain't fair. I just don't want you getting hurt on my account, Alim said hotly. Looking at the pair, 42 crossed her arms and let out a sigh. For fuck's sake. Alim, just let her talk, 42 said, voice rising in volume though it still sounded quite somehow. Mistress, Alim started but fell silent at a glare. Look, if you cut her off, this will just get worse. Let me finish talking to her, then you can say your bit, 42 said sternly. Reluctantly Alim nodded then backed off. He went outside the cave or seemed to, given how the dim light from outside flashed briefly. Okay, he'll be good, for a couple minutes anyway. So ask away, 42 said. Why can't he get out of the contract? Tiller asked without hesitation. Because I have no reason to let him out of it, mostly. Also, before you ask, I'm not interested in trading for you. You seem nice enough, but I already know I can rely on him, 42 said evenly. That's all? Because it's convenient to you? Tiller asked, taken aback. She'd expected something along the lines of arcane ritual rules or the demands of magic honor or something. The truth being practical hadn't been something she'd expected. Look, I'm a scary shadow monster, not an idiot. Most of my decisions are based on personal convenience, 42 said simply. Tiller stared, caught mentally flat-footed in surprise. She hadn't expected the shadow monster to call itself one. This was the second strike against her fundamental understanding of the situation. Alim said you're a dungeon master, Tiller ventured. That wasn't something she'd had to pull like teeth. Storm had recognized the potion bottle and the lingering magic as coming from one. To Tiller, it had just been a fantastically detailed bottle in the shape of a leaf. One that seemed like it had to have come from fairies or something else mythical. She'd been around some wonderful artisan's work and knew the bottle hadn't come from human hands. That I am, 42 said agreeably. Then can I make my own deal with you? Tiller asked. No. I'm pretty sure Alim would be furious with both of us if I did. Besides, I don't really know you. Alim was in need, bad enough I didn't doubt his motive. So you're a wild card, 42 explained. Why do Alim's feelings about it matter? Tiller asked. She was more perplexed about that part than any other. Do you think they shouldn't? 42 countered. I think I don't really understand you. My demonic hawk was quick to make a deal with me instead of someone else, and not for a special reason. I'd just prepared a better bribe for him, Tiller conceded. Thinking about that and the way the bird had flown greedily to her almost made her smile. Her brother could rot for all she cared, family tradition be damned. Demons and demonic creatures are a whole different kind of thing. Not that I know any other dungeon masters personally, 42 offered with a shrug. After talking with her for a few minutes, Tiller wasn't feeling intimidated anymore. Or at least not as much as she had at the start. 42 was still rather fearsome to look at, but she sounded more or less like a person. A bit like someone's mom, really, though not Alim's specifically. Jessica had a more dignified air while 42 mostly seemed more the long-suffering type. I've already made a deal with a demonic hawk. It seems like I could get a lot better out of one with you, and I'd rather Alim not push me out, Tiller offered. The last bit stung as it came off her lips. It was true, but she was casting it as bait rather than admitting it freely. Her family was shit, but they knew how to make deals. Building rapport was important, and looking a little vulnerable didn't hurt if you knew what you were doing. Well, then you definitely shouldn't make a deal with me. Going behind his back won't help you make a decent relationship with him, 42 said simply. Relationship? Tiller asked, dumbfounded. You want to date him or something, right? Whatever your local word for courtship is. Or am I way off the mark? 42 asked. Tiller opened her mouth to reply, then closed it again. Most of her life revolved around working with people, not making friends, let alone looking for more. I mean, even a good friendship should have a solid foundation. At least stable enough that you don't think the other party will run off and make contracts with monsters behind your back, 42 continued. She either didn't notice or was ignoring Tiller's unease. If you really want to make a deal, talk to Alim first. The upfront cost might be your friendship with him, 42 said solemnly. Right, Tiller said flatly. Her face felt like it was on fire. Her mother had always called her impulsive, but she'd never given the matter much thought. Probably a rather obvious warning sign in hindsight. 42 gave a shrug then seemed to fade from view. Something in the air changed after a moment and Tiller had the feeling she was alone. A welcome development as she had a head full of uncomfortable questions to sort out. Ones she could have lived without. Like why exactly she'd been willing to tangle herself up with trouble of such a magnitude in the first place. Going by what Alim had told her, the deal he'd made gave a lot of tangible rewards. Making a deal herself would be beneficial from a purely mercenary study of the matter. She'd known that going in but hadn't been interested in making a deal for its own sake. Tiller's idea had been what she'd first said, switching places with Alim by hook or crook. It wasn't something she'd have done for nearly anyone else she knew. Alim fit into an illustrious group of exactly 3 people she actually cared about personally. I'm guessing you already knew how this would go, Tiller offered. Alim shifted and cleared his throat in embarrassment behind her. I suspected, though I didn't know. I was kind of hoping she'd scare you off, Alim admitted. Might have worked if you didn't get in the middle like that. She was pretty intimidating until that part, Tiller lied. Of course, 42 was intimidating the whole way through. It was only that she'd come expecting worse that let Tiller get through it. Shit, Alim cursed in frustration. Tiller smiled at that, glad to get under his skin a bit. Look, the other thing 42 said? Don't worry about it any. I won't push you away, but I'm not expecting anything, Alim offered awkwardly. Okay, but could you help me out of here? My legs seem to have stopped working, Tiller asked. Since the conversation with 42 ended, she'd been trying to leave the cave. Unfortunately, her legs flat out wouldn't listen. Oh, wow, yeah. No problem, Alim said and hurried to pull her out. Tiller was glad Storm was off sulking somewhere. The bastard would have fallen out the air laughing if he'd seen the state she was in. Chapter 91. Optional options. I drummed my fingers on my thigh as I considered the conversation with Tiller. She seemed nice enough from what very little I knew about her. The contract with the demonic hawk was a surprise but nothing catastrophic. What little I could find in my encyclopedia painted demonic animal contracts as reasonably straightforward. As Tiller put it, a bribe would be offered, and if the creature accepted, a pact was made. The demon got the bonded human's mana to itself for power but had to render service in exchange. No years of lives or souls changed hands. Despite the good news, my mind was fixed on something else. Tiller asking about making a contract had latched like a barb in my mind. I'd been honest, I wasn't going to for now, but it wasn't totally impossible. Tiller would have to be honest with Alim. That was a given. Lying to someone I'd already built up a decent working relationship with was at best counterproductive. Despite that, I wasn't sure which way I'd go in the end if it came down to it. Like I'd said to the woman herself, she was a wild card from my perspective. Mistress Chris whined. I looked over, my glare cutting him off. He'd spent a while writing pants are not a hat on a chalkboard I'd set up just for him. The incident being half my fault, I'd told him to write it as many times as he could rather than set a specific goal. So far, he'd only managed to write it 30 times. Unfortunately, Chris wasn't really fastidious about his handwriting. Still, he tried to make it legible, so I cut him some slack. 10 more times, then you're done, I said, then sighed. He'd been relatively meek after having most of the Bone Brigade see his illusionary fleshy bits. Illusionary fleshy bits which were firmly in the off position for the moment. Why Chris had been wearing pants on his head when I activated the illusion of life was still a mystery I didn't care about getting an answer to. I could turn the illusion of life on, off, and edit Chris's appearance. However, I'd decided it was more manageable to turn it off until his punishment was over. Though things had gotten weird, I was game to try again. So as Chris entered the home stretch, I started preparing for round 2. I took a mirror out of storage and set some of Chris's clothes next to him in a neat pile. If he was wearing pants would not be left to chance this time. Chris got dressed without protest, thankfully. I opened the editing panel for his illusion of life. I straight up winced at what I saw. I had a kind of mental image of Chris with skin that was Dickensian in nature. Like the artful dodger grown up and foul-mouthed after a stint in an institution of higher learning. Rough but very much still a TV movie good-looking teenager. The kid I was looking at was an incarnation of poverty and disease, not a Hollywood representation of genteel poverty. There was some kind of rash on his face, acne, bad teeth. It was a long list of things that added up to living hard and eating poorly. That wasn't even counting the burns, scars, and other signs of repeat abuse. Chris, is this what you looked like when you were alive? I asked in a neutral voice. It took a hellacious amount of effort to manage that. Fortunately, Chris had been facing the wrong way as he pulled on his clothes and didn't catch any of my internal struggles. Dunno, oh shit, yeah. That's me all right, Chris said, sounding pleased. Oh, good, just wanted to make sure, I said, not letting anything untoward leak into my voice. What are all these things? Chris asked, pointing at the editing options. Well, because it's magic, you can change how you look a bit. Watch, I said as I selected an option. It removed the acne, and Chris leaned in to examine the image of himself. Well, I was already the handsomest lad in the Downs. Couldn't hurt to put a spit shine on it, Chris said with a kind of glee. Yeah, you can feel free to make whatever edits you want, I said. Then, as if the system had been waiting for those exact words, a new window popped open. This one was clearly oriented from Chris's view. He jumped back in surprise, and it followed him. After getting over having a window of his own, Chris immediately started checking options, turning things on and off with abandon. You can also feel free to activate or turn off your illusion yourself. So long as you are wearing pants in public when it's on and you aren't above ground when you try to turn it off, I added. With Chris's new activity casting a spell over him, he'd gone to grab a can of chaos and flop on the couch. I had around an hour to myself to think. I was doing my best not to think about Chris and what kind of life left someone looking like he had at 16. Unfortunately, I failed pretty miserably at it. It was one of the weird aspects of the skeletons. I knew they were evil according to their alignments. I was even willing to say a lot of them had done some fairly heinous shit by choice. But at the same time, I didn't really get the cartoon villain vibe from any of them. They felt like people who'd grown up in shitty places who'd made bad choices. Of course, it didn't excuse the fairly long list of terrible things, but it made me question the label. It seemed pretty unfair, especially since the gods, or what have you didn't much seem to care about ordinary lives. Mistress! Chris crowed triumphantly, running over to me and doing a full turn. He'd reactivated his illusion, and I was looking at a much healthier but still rough Fight Club Christmas elf of a boy. One ear was nicked and possibly bitten. A scar ran vertically from just beside his chin up through his lips. Another ran horizontally just under his eyes through his nose. Finally, what I felt was a scar from a noose encircled his neck. Didn't take the first time, Chris chirped. He'd noticed me looking at the noose scar. His clothes consisted of a sleeveless tunic and shorts, so I could still see a fair amount of him. He had several scars and a couple of burns on his body, like his face. There was also a tattoo of a snake coiling around his bicep. Is that the World Eater? I asked, distracted from the scar on his calf. The figure was typical in most religious doctrines I'd browsed. It held a place less like the devil and more Tholuian in nature. The inevitable end of the world that could only be delayed. Yet. Do I have to remove it? Chris asked with a smirk that didn't mask something hard in his eyes. He'd always given me a bored scamp with a heart of gold vibe, but that was under the highly controlled conditions of the dungeon. What sort of person he'd be if he had free reign and wasn't surrounded by functionally immortal monsters wasn't something I knew. No, though I'd like to know what it means to you, I answered. Not how I got it. Chris countered with a smile. There was a disconnect between his easygoing tone and how he looked at me. I didn't doubt he was amused. His emotions felt sincerely expressed. The thing getting under my skin was a predatory glitter in his eyes. Some guy stabbed you with inky needles, repeatedly, I replied, and he chuckled. You're not wrong, Chris said with a smirk. I was part of a cult of the serpent, sort of. I did what they asked. They gave me money and a place to sleep. I thought it was a good deal, but they apparently grew tired of my lack of faith in a lack of faith, Chris said, pointing at the noose mark. So, nihilism I started but stopped. It was probably one of those things that wouldn't mean anything to Chris. That's the name of a philosophy from my old world. It meant rejecting faith, morals, and pretty much anything that claims life or how it's lived has an inherent value. Basically, everything's made up, and nothing has meaning, I explained. It was just one of many doctrines people made up, and some even lived by. I probably felt a lot less uncomfortable about that kind of thing than someone from this world would. Sounds close enough, just tag on so do what we say and I think you've got it, Chris said before snickering. Want to hang out, or would you rather show off your new look? I asked. I felt proud I'd managed to be pretty chill about his tattoo. Finding out about the nihilistic doom cult was off-putting. Despite that, I remembered what he looked like without editing. Like he'd lived a life hard enough to make buddying up with that cult, despite not believing, seem like a good idea. Definitely going to show off, Chris said with impish delight. I got a moderate to middling lousy feeling about his delight but let it be. He had a new look. He deserved to show it off and feel cute. Chapter 92. Correspondence. I was totally out of excuses, distractions, and emergencies. It was past time I read Henry's letter, so I finally took it out of my inventory. The paper was one of the nicer ones I'd refined, but the seal was a surprise. I'd provided wax but not a seal stamp for it. Henry must have made his own. It was a rose with a needle and a sword crossed behind it. It was well done and frankly rather cute in my opinion. Fuck. I growled only to start laughing. No matter what I did, things were going to change between us once I was done reading. How and why were yet to be seen, but it was unavoidable. That was the part that kept putting me in a loop of hesitation. I wasn't scared, but I liked how things were and basic cowardice compelled me not to change them. Summoning my resolve, I broke the seal. The penmanship, as usual, was impeccable. The letter was 4 sheets front and back with a 5th on the outside as a cover. The contents were a rather interesting blend of a historical and personal account. I'd have enjoyed reading it if it had been about someone I didn't know. As it was, I found out I couldn't cry, because I sure as fuck should have been bawling by the end of it. Just the first part was a harrowing read. Henry had grown up in an artisan family, and his father had sold him to the military as a slave when he was 14. They, in turn, had used him as an assassin, because why not? His life had carried on like that for quite a while, his early 20s apparently. That was when the king of his country had started losing his mind. Being of divine lineage, none of the nobles were willing to do anything serious about him since it would put them on the wrong side of the church. They also weren't suffering much, unlike the commoners. As was often the case, nobody seemed to remember the army was primarily composed of commoners. So when things got bad and revolts started happening, the nobles tried to suppress them. That was when their own forces started turning on them. That led to the hiring of foreign mercenaries, and then things got properly nasty. Henry joined in on the revolt and was quickly noticed by some of the organizers for killing high-profile targets. The rebellion leader put Henry to work, and his deeds became propaganda. He became the grave man. Suddenly a lot of things clicked into place. The stories Chris had mentioned weren't terribly similar to what Henry wrote about, but that made sense. They were 100 or so years apart in terms of when they'd lived. The tales would have grown taller in the telling and had the rough edges worn down. I couldn't even imagine how frustrating it would be to hear stories turning your trauma into heroic tales. What Henry had lived through hadn't ended cheerfully by any means. The Mad King was eventually slain. The nobles who'd hired mercenaries were hunted like animals. Those who hadn't mostly fled or fell victim to pillaging. The church thought to step in and assume control, but they'd used up all goodwill when insisting the king's supposed origin was more important than what he was doing. That left a power vacuum and lots of newly minted heroes of the people to fill it. True to form, the leaders who emerged during the revolt weren't all idealists. Even the ones who were, didn't necessarily have the kinds of skills needed to run a country. Corruption didn't end, and without a coherent leadership body, the country collapsed into feuding city-states. Henry got front row seats to everything he'd fought for going to hell in a handbasket. Adding insult to injury, some of the more competent former liberators turned into petty despots. They fought and squabbled over the carcass of the country instead of trying to sort things out. Taking that none too well, Henry had turned to hunting former allies as he once had the nobles. Nothing in the letter indicated it improved matters any. Henry had been, unfortunately, self-aware on that point. He seemed to understand destabilizing things further wasn't helping, but had been in a pretty severe downward spiral and on drugs at that point. Initially, they had started as pain management and then took a rather predictable turn. Pain aside, he'd been in a bad place mentally for basically his entire life. I looked up some of the things he mentioned narcotics-wise. The names were all for essentially different preparations of opium rather than entirely separate drugs. Things did not get better. Henry was in his early 40s when he died. He'd been captured while high and misidentified as someone else. He'd sobered up just before being walked up to the gallows. He'd laughed and confessed to what he'd actually done. How the crowd had taken it was unclear. Seeing his executioner had frozen in surprise, Henry had kicked the man's knee out to force the lever to drop the platform. He hadn't been interested in what anyone thought of him and just wanted it done with. I was curled into a kind of knot by the time I finished reading. My internal anguish expressed itself in the only physical outlet for it that I apparently had. I stayed like that for a while, digesting everything. Without knowing much about Henry going into the letter, I'd expected to feel differently on the other side of it. Not profoundly, really, but like I knew him better. Instead, I had a much expanded shit list and a genuine wish I could cry like a human. I'd even take crying acid if it gave the same emotional relief. Unfortunately, turning into a sadness pretzel did not scratch the itch. It occurred to me that I should probably pen a reply of some kind. Or at least send him a text to let him know I'd read it. Henry. I've read your letter and my feelings about you haven't changed. I discarded that draft immediately. It was a fairly transparent lie and one that wouldn't be doing either of us any favors. It was right up there with saying I didn't feel anything like pity. I didn't, but wording it like that would just imply that I did but didn't want him to think I did. Apparently I could not summon the needed brain cells to construct simple sentiments that weren't full of landmines. I needed something less complicated with lower stakes. Alternative activities I could pursue included continuing to lay around, which wasn't appealing, and getting to work. The second one was my usual go-to, but I quickly found that like writing a reply, I wasn't in the right headspace for it. Rather than a new dungeon feature, I started on a standard of living upgrade to my chamber of machinations. I added an extra room with a door on the right-hand side near the back side of the room, furthest from the entrance. It took me all of 10 seconds to come to hate the arrangement. I ignored the door issue for the moment and made a second room on the opposite side. I only had a vague idea of what the first space would be for. It was the one on the left I had real plans for. The second room was where I moved all my drawings and dungeon-related stuff. Playfully, I carved Chamber of Machinations on the door. I'd been thinking of the single room I'd been living out of as such before, but it made more sense as a formal work office rather than the name of the whole space. Chamber being singular and whatnot. That part wasn't important. The important part was I was officially no longer living in what amounted to a studio apartment. For a moment I felt very much like an adult. That I could have done this at any point and just hadn't thought of it didn't bear consideration. I'd just been prioritizing more important things, not oblivious. The fact that Dawn wouldn't have walked in on me and Henry so easily, however, hit me like a cold bucket of day. The realization also reminded me I'd put my build lab on a different level, for reasons. Doing my best to ignore how I felt like an idiot, I moved it next to, and connected it with my new Chamber of Machinations. Now I registered the new issue that I needed a name for everything since I'd recategorized one piece exclusively as a workspace. Names weren't a thing I was good at. My first instinct was DM Den. I felt like slapping myself for it. Anything involving the word apartment, pad, flat, or crib were also out on principle. After a few minutes I gave up and went with Palace of Shadows. It was insanely pretentious for what amounted to a 4-room condo, but I liked it. Making the space fit the name was something I could do in time. Thinking of time, I realized my attempt to kill it had only eaten up about 15 minutes. Today was going to be a long day if I spent it fruitlessly trying to avoid something that should have been simple. I started new drafts, working through 8 before hitting something sendable. Henry. I just finished reading your letter. I'd like to talk about it when you feel up to it. -42. I wasn't going to say it was a good reply. It certainly wasn't, but at least it was sort of neutrally ominous rather than implying the wrong things. I sent it before I could second-guess myself into not. If I let that impulse take hold for too long I was going to end up locking my door and just never facing anyone ever again. Chapter 93. Catering Confusion. With my reply sent, I felt a small amount of motivation return. It was time I got back to my actual work, as well as some planning. Since the test for the illusion of life was successful, I decided I would do some mass skeleton upgrades next. That meant freeing up mana. I reviewed the raid footage and found it was about as unhelpful as I expected. The party didn't really fight well, for the most part. Really, the only thing watching did was highlight the odd moments where they'd tried to resist the spell controlling them. It was pretty sad. Since I didn't have any new information to work from, I wrote up a 2-week plan. My priority was expanding and refining the stub layers into full ones. While I was laying out my to-do list for the week, I thought of something interesting. Dipping into my items shop, I picked out paired communication stones. They were similar to walkie-talkies. I put one half of a pair in the room with Mina and Andrea, along with a note explaining its use while I kept the other one. I sent 2 sets to Alim so he'd have options for contacting Tiller and his family, if he chose to use them. I considered giving Myra and Heta a pair, but elected not to just yet. I was still considering how I'd approach them, and that seemed like a bit much for the moment. With that little burst of inspiration exhausted, I got back to the more grinding work of planning floor layouts. I had some rough sketches already, but wanted to refine them a bit. I felt like they lacked personality, which didn't sit right with me. "Hello?" a female voice inquired. Hearing a voice that wasn't mine echoing in my chamber of machinations caused me to jump several feet into the air. It took a moment for me to remember the communication device I'd given to the girls. "Hello, this is 42, how can I help you?" I said after composing myself. It came out kind of politely fake, but it was the best I could do. I hadn't been expecting anyone to call, let alone after only a couple of hours. "Oh, hello. Can we request a different dinner?" Mina asked. I only knew it was her because I'd spied on the pair while they were talking a few times. I kept that to myself. Sure. I have 2 alternative salad dressings, pork, beef, or fish main courses, and a selection of soups, I replied, knowing my inventory of food pretty well. They had been eating what I sent since their own rations had run out. It had only taken them a day to break down and eat the hot meals I offered once they got hungry enough to give in and try the rations I provided. I wondered if something had happened that might have specifically prompted the call. I'd sent them salad and roasted chicken, which Alim liked. It had seemed like a safe choice. 1 pork and a beef. I guess surprise us with the soup. Mina continued. She misunderstood the actual number of options since I'd said it poorly. "Hang on," I said. I started constructing a menu and an order slip in my image editor using pictures from my inventory. It would be time-consuming to do an ingredients list though, so I skipped that. As such, I limited the options to what I could write out in a few minutes, then placed them in the room. "Do you have any allergies?" I started. "What the hell? Mina. We agreed not to." Andrea's voice came through loud and clear along with a yelp from Mina. The sound of a stone hitting stone followed, but the connection didn't cut out since I was still holding mine. Not that I needed it to spy. I immediately opened a window to check in on them. "What does it matter if I ask for different food?" Mina demanded defensively. She was facing off against Andrea, both of them looking pissed off and tired. "If we start talking to them, they'll figure things out," Andrea countered. A reasonable argument, since she didn't know I had Myra as an alternative information source. Though what she thought she knew that I'd care about was anyone's guess. "I'm sick of chicken," Mina shouted, and sounded on the verge of tears. Being confined wasn't easy no matter how comfortable the conditions were. The disdain for chicken confused me though. Like a creep rather than ask, I went straight to my event log. Scanning the past couple of days, I wanted to kick myself. I'd been lost in thought and sent them the chicken dinner for every meal for a day and a half. I could see most people's resolve weakening in the face of that kind of monotony. "Sure, ask what they fucking did with Lillian and Reiner's bodies while you're at it," Andrea shouted. Her original personality had started to assert itself aggressively once the lily pendant was removed. She was quite the hothead from what I'd seen. It must have been absolute hell to be forced into such a contradictory set of behaviors. I felt bad for Mina, but it wasn't like Andrea was wrong not to trust me. If our situations were reversed, I could see myself intentionally being a nuisance to my captor. These two had just kind of moped. I placed them in marked crypts in a small chamber, I said. I couldn't leave the bodies near them in the open without health consequences. It didn't change that taking them away had been a bad move for trust building. I could have placed the crypts in the safe zone if I'd been thinking about it. Why? Mina demanded. I was wondering if she thought I was lying and regretting asking for a pork option for dinner. To preserve them. You can bury them later. Or carry out whatever sort of funeral is appropriate. Once we can reach an agreement anyway, I offered. I'm aware this will sound bullshit, but I'd actually rather let you two go. The problem is that I need some binding promises before that. I won't put myself at risk by letting you go without them, I added, needing the conversation to move forward. Such as what? Andrea asked, and I was tempted to just send her a contract. The fact that she'd likely close it without reading it and waste my time was all that stopped me. You won't talk about what happened here beyond some broad strokes. Also, no coming back to try to take revenge or going through a proxy, I said, not sure if they'd thought that far ahead. I can get behind that. Mina said in a grumpy tone. I guess we can think about that much. I want to see the written terms first though, Andrea said. Her response was more reasonable than I expected. I created a contract, then copied it over to a parchment document. I dropped it into the room as I removed the unwanted dinners. All right, so take a look at the menu for now. We can worry about the contract when you aren't hangry, I said, and cut off as a gasp came through the other side. Hangry? How do you know that word? Mina demanded. From my old world, I started only to get cut off again by a squeal of joy. Did you get transported to the game world playing a Vermeer page too? Mina demanded, and my orbs flickered a couple times in confusion. What the fuck was a Vermeer page? Wait, do you mean a virtual reality massive multiplayer online role-playing game? I asked as the acronym started to untangle itself in my brain. I knew what all of the worlds meant singularly, but getting my head around the combination took a second. That kind of stuff was sci-fi to me. Yes. Mina shouted, looking excited. Oh, wow, no. I died when 4K TVs were still a thing, I replied, feeling a bit stunned. What's a TV? Mina asked. Either something was getting lost in translation or, from another world or not, we were from very different places. Chapter 94. A nice chat. It took a couple of hours and many follow-up questions to sort things out between Mina and I, mainly because of the similarities, rather than the differences. Neither of us being any kind of expert hadn't helped. Finally, we agreed we weren't from the same place, rather than from different time periods. We figured out they were both called Earth and had similar cultures, geography, and shared some historical events. It was when we started naming countries the differences became apparent. Russia and Prussia were both modern countries in Mina's case. No world wars? That's pretty different, I said with flickering orbs. The history of her world only had smaller-scale inter-country wars, a reflection of how the nations were smaller and more isolationist. Also, no one had assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but not for want of trying. Yet, it's weird you have space rockets but no VR. I mean, do people game professionally where you're from? I'm a third-tier solo player, which is pretty good, since I only made my debut a year ago, Mina asked. I had to think about it. It's different between countries and not nearly as advanced as what you described, I offered with a shrug. Going by how little I knew about it, either there hadn't been much, or I hadn't been interested. I suspected the former rather than the latter, since the terms made sense. So not all summoned hero people are from the same place? Andrea asked. Belatedly, I realized we'd been ignoring her while comparing notes. In fairness, it wasn't really a conversation she could add much to as a local. I can't be certain, but all evidence points to yes, I said. I could see in my display that Myra was nodding in agreement. Yeah, evil might summon from totally different worlds from good too, Myra offered. I felt an uncomfortable little twitch at her word choice. Chaos, I corrected. What? Andrea asked. She was distracted as she picked at what was left of a dessert cobbler. Most of the food Alim provided was pretty good, but I'd upgraded the hell out of the sweets. I wasn't sure why, but those had come up an entire grade lower than any other foods. Possibly a cost issue, I remembered sugar used to be a luxury good, historically. I was summoned by chaos, not evil, I explained. I wasn't going to get into my alignment change, but I felt like that much needed to be said. Steve had been good to me more than once, and I didn't feel like it was right to let that go. Oh. Yeah, I guess no one said that for me either, just that I was on the side of order, Myra said after some thought. I'm lawful good, though. I guess. My stats say it, but I've done some awful stuff, Myra added. She looked dispirited as she finished, and I felt terrible for her. You were under mind control. It would be a dick move to judge you by that, I said flatly. It probably wasn't comforting coming from me, but I hoped she wouldn't be too hard on herself. I agree with our captor, Andrea said, and the pair started giggling. It was a bit absurd I was giving my prisoner a pep talk. I refrained from joining in on the laughter, since I didn't know how I'd sound to them. The skeletons were unbothered by it, but they were monsters like I was. I could full-on villain cackle and they probably wouldn't bat a jewel. Once the girls stopped laughing, I took a look outside with an extra window. Seeing darkness, I figured it was probably past time we stopped our chat. The girls likely should get some rest. All right, let's talk again tomorrow. Use the stone again when you're ready, I said and set mine down once the pair agreed. I should have gotten back to work after I was done talking to Myra and Andrea, but I couldn't. For the first time in a while, I felt uncomfortable in my own skin and not because of system weirdness. My hand went to my lips. I explored them as I contemplated our discussion. Myra and Andrea both had food preferences. I didn't. Picking a meal out of my inventory, I raised a block of stone to act as a table and set it down. It was a pot pie, and I could smell pastry and butter clearly over the more subtle scent of its filling. Though my sense of smell was working fine, my mouth didn't water. I didn't feel like I was looking at food, but something more like a fragrant art piece. It was nice, but it didn't trigger any physiological reaction. I put it away untouched. I'd thought I'd enjoy talking to someone from my world or a world like it. Instead, my experience with Myra had been uncomfortable. The information about her world was interesting, but the way she talked had been a bit off-putting. She had opinions and preferences on just about everything. I felt limited in comparison. Certainly anyone who took even a cursory look around the dungeon would see I had preferences when it came to design. I'd even argue that while opinions on my aesthetic sense might vary, no one could deny I had style. Dungeon matters were as much work as part of my identity. Despite that, I felt uneasy at how little I had outside of it. It hadn't been long ago I'd decided I had a favorite color. Green. A color I was starting to question. The more I thought about it, the less satisfied I was with green. It wasn't as if I'd suddenly developed a distaste for it though. It was subtler than that. Now, if I thought of favorites, blue came to mind. I looked myself over in the mirror I'd placed earlier. I tried to picture something. I didn't think clothes were the right choice in my case. At least not the kind involving things like full skirts or pants. I could do legs if I felt like it, but they weren't part of my natural state. Accessories were probably going to be more comfortable and practical. Maybe a new hairstyle. I thought about the appearance editor, but immediately flinched away from the idea. Fucking around with an alternative appearance was something I should do when I wasn't in a weird headspace about my looks. Ideally anyway. It wasn't bad to want to change things, but I didn't like the idea of doing it because of something as nebulous as what I was feeling. More to the point, despite trying to picture something, nothing clicked. I caught a flash of blue in the corner of the reflection. Turning, I looked at the niche where I'd put the roses Henry made for me. I couldn't help laughing fondly as I looked at them. Blue like his jewels, no wonder my favorite color had changed. I leaned back, bonking my head on the mirror. I was probably overthinking things after being around the living again. Particularly such lively examples. Before, I hadn't talked to Alim at length about such personal but frivolous topics. He also wasn't a teenage girl whose favorite hobby after virtual monster slaying was nail art. Really, what was the use of having a favorite food if you didn't eat? Or a sense of taste, for that matter. Fixating on things that didn't apply to me was only going to drive me insane. If I let it anyway. Also, it wasn't like the clothing thing only applied to myself. I could design clothes for the dungeon denizens if I felt like it, but I never had. I was happy to edit things or add designs to clothes or fabric, but I never felt motivated about fashion itself. I was starting to feel like I'd been a tracksuit and Mountain Dew RPG nerd and I didn't know how to feel about that. Chapter 95. Apology Pie. Alim watched with interest as the clear jewel sunk into the pond. As it went, the water started to clear up, and it seemed to vanish in the depths. The pond didn't become as glass clear as the well, but there was a distinct shift in its appearance. It didn't seem like much, but Alim still felt wonder as he watched. He'd done the same thing all morning. Finding water sources and dropping purification stones in them never got old. Alim's mild horror at how much some of the water changed in appearance was also unabated. He was truly glad his family kept to its well rather than the ones in town. It had only changed mildly in color, unlike the one in the village center. It was no wonder that travelers often took sick after drinking from it. "Done, mistress," Alim said to the air. He'd had a voice call open with 42 all morning as he went about his work. "Nice, take the rest of the day and have lunch with your family," 42 replied graciously. "Wouldn't it be better to try and finish the village today?" Alim asked. He'd arrived home the day before, and after some cursory greetings, he'd been sent out with the excuse of quality time with Bess. Tiller and his mother had a very long talk while he was gone, to his dismay. When Alim had returned home a few hours afterward, it had been to find the pair companionably drinking tea. A fine turn of events that was. It was good they got on well. The problem was they'd both been wearing twin looks of exasperation for him. After that, Alim had been glad 42's plan required him to be out of the house. It seemed the only female not upset with him was Bess. She'd followed him around all morning like a duckling but gone on home in anticipation of lunch and her afternoon nap. "I've got enough crystals for it, but you shouldn't push yourself too much. You've been crawling around in mud and dank all morning as it is," 42 replied. Alim hadn't told her about his home issue, so she was being massively unhelpful with her sweet consideration. "Right, still feels like I should do more," Alim ventured. "Well, it would be good to start working on getting people to take the potions. Do you have a tradition of mixing drinks? I don't know how a potion would interact with beer, but you might be able to trick them with something like a sake bomb," 42 offered. "Sake bomb?" Alim asked with open confusion. "Ah, right. Sake is a kind of rice wine. It makes beer foam up so people would drop a shot glass of it in," 42 explained. "If you know a drink the potion would pair with taste-wise, you could mix them, and I'd check if it was safe in the inventory. Then, if it works, you can get people to take it by throwing a party or something," 42 continued. "The yellow ones, right?" Alim asked. 42 hummed in confirmation, and he helped himself. "Cider or mead," Alim said after a few tentative sips. The potion wasn't foul-tasting but kind of bland and herbal, like a weak mixed tea. It needed something that would bring out its flavors pleasantly and give sweetness. Easily done then. You have non-alcoholic cider, right? The kids should drink this too, 42 asked. Yeah, though I don't see why they'd need it specially, Alim said. The potion or the cider? 42 asked. The cider. I mean, they shouldn't have much of the hard stuff because it's usually potent, but everyone drinks ale, Alim explained. 42 had mentioned him being too young to drink beer when they first met. It made him wonder what kind of rules her kind had and how long they lived for him to seem too young for it. Right, I keep forgetting. Look, I know it makes water safe to drink, and that's probably most of why you do it, but it's not good for children. Or pregnant women. I get stuff like rubbing whiskey on a teeth child's gum seems like a good idea, but it's really not, 42 explained. If you say so. I'll mix some test batches now, Alim offered. He figured 42 probably had a reason for saying all that, but it was probably complicated, and he wasn't in a mood for lengthy explanations. So instead, he took out more potions along with small bottles of the drinks they'd discussed, including hard cider and not. He combined them and then put them back for 42 to check. Looks like they're safe and still effective. Time for a final taste test, 42 said simply. Alim obliged and found he'd been on the mark for flavors. He wasn't a proper cook, but he generally knew how to pair things together in an edible fashion. Gods be kind to anyone eating something he'd made from scratch instead of cobbling it together out of rations, though. Not bad, Alim said for 42's benefit. Would it seem out of place for you to have a couple of small barrels of this stuff at home? I could pre-mix it, then you throw a party and serve it, 42 asked. Not really. I mean, we make all of the local mead since my mum keeps bees. Be a bit harder to explain the cider, Alim mused. Well, maybe not. I could just say I bought some barrels of juice when I was last home, and it's finally set up. Though they might ask Mum how she did it, Alim said as he considered it. His mother had taught him to make mead, it wasn't hard, but he didn't know a thing about cider. Not properly anyway. Leaving juice in a barrel till it turned would not do as an explanation to anyone nosy. I broke one down, and the recipe isn't complicated. Just juice, yeast, some stuff for the yeast, and flavorings, 42 offered. Wait, you have the recipe? Like the full list of the stuff they add for flavor too? Alim asked. He understood she could copy things with startling accuracy, but he hadn't considered what the full scope of her powers might include. Yeah, I can get one for anything I break down. I even have the same apples they used to make the juice. I get a pattern with instructions, leather, and whatnot when I break down boots too, 42 explained. Mistress, truly, you are a wonder, Alim said appreciatively. Neat, thanks, 42 replied, sounding suspicious of him. Rightfully so, Alim knew. If there were ever going to be a way to dig himself out of the hole he'd dug with his mother, this would be it. He just needed a plan now. The families that have taken sick already won't be coming round the village. So it would be neighborly of me to drop by with some food and drink. People helped my mother after all, and one should look after their neighbors, Alim offered. That's an excellent idea. I fixed up that hand cart you picked up yesterday. Once you get close to a house, you can pull it out and fill it with goods for a care package, 42 agreed happily. Alim sighed and laughed. It was easy to forget that she'd asked him to send strangers to their doom not long before. 42. Would it be alright if I were honest when baiting people your way? For me to outright tell them there's a dungeon? Alim asked. It was a question that had been burning at the back of his throat since that day in the tavern. He'd blatantly hinted at it to the heroes, but he hadn't flat out said it. Yet? I mean, I assumed you would. I can't really see adventurers coming this far out unless they thought something worthwhile was waiting for them, 42 replied, like it was natural. I supposed not, Alim agreed. He felt a weight taken from his shoulders. The group with the strange magic had been some form of threat to Tiller, so he hadn't minded screwing them over. Despite that, lying didn't sit well with him. It was one thing for someone to knowingly choose to go and risk themselves for a reward. It was another to trick people. I'll do what I can to find people who aren't too strong, Alim said. He'd already done it once and was contract-bound to do most of what 42 asked. Despite that, this was the first time he formally agreed to do as she'd asked. Thanks. Honestly, I'm banking on anyone you tell being too greedy to share the news to keep things manageable. Still, someone too strong showing up is a risk, 42 said softly, almost as if talking to herself. Alim nodded soberly. He hadn't considered that. Even if he aimed for the relatively weak, there was a chance they'd pass along word to someone dangerous. That's... You've got those fire dogs. I mean, not many can stand up to those. I'm sure they'll be enough, Alim offered. He felt a rather uncomfortable pang at the idea of 42 getting into trouble. She was a bit strange, and a literal monster, but he rather liked her. That she was too far away for him to help her if something happened didn't help. Very true, Alim, I'm sure I'll be fine, 42 replied gently. Now, is there any particular cider you want me to break down? I've got like 15 different kinds thanks to your alcoholism, 42 added with a chuckle. Alim laughed too, though he had no idea what alcoholism was. Oh, the bacon one, the mirth of Tima, and that really sweet one with the flowers on the bottle, Alim replied easily. Most ciders didn't have names proper and were just a house drink at various taverns. Alim had made a point of tossing one into the inventory every time he came across a new one. Mirth of Tima was an exception as it was the product of a church, holy symbol on the jug and all. I have a question though. Can you get the recipe for a food if I give you some? Like for a pie, would you need a whole one or would a slice or two be enough? Alim asked. A slice should be fine. I've never really bothered figuring out minimum sample sizes, but it worked just fine with that slice of blueberry you dropped in, 42 explained. Good, good. So, just suppose, if I were to acquire some foods, you wouldn't mind giving me the recipes? Alim asked. Alim, 42 said flatly. Alim winced and wondered what malicious deity had given everything female that way of saying a man's name that made him feel like he was 5 and caught with his hand in a jam jar. Look, I'm in hot water with my mum. I figure she'll forgive me though if I can get Doris Holt's pie recipe, Alim admitted. Doris Holt? 42 asked, sounding completely confused. She's nice enough, but she always beats my mum at the pies and is a total sow about it. If we leave like we've planned, it will be just after the next fete. I figure mum would fancy being able to beat her the once before we go, Alim explained. What did you fuck up so badly that you're resorting to pie-based espionage? 42 asked. Alim didn't know what espionage was and was past caring about odd words. He got the gist of what she was asking. Well, I didn't exactly. He fumbled. Tiller told her what you are, Alim admitted. Oh, well. You get that pie. I'll help out as much as I can, 42 said weakly. Chapter 96. Suggestions. As Alim worked, I was keeping track on my side of things. I had a map view open in my image editor, and I'd traced Selton and the surrounding area. It was an evolving project, the map updating with detail as Alim moved. Fortunately, it auto-detected water sources, though it didn't label them. I'd sent him on a wild goose chase after a huge washing barrel early in the morning, mistaking it for a well. So, that's one family done, Alim chirped. He'd just got done paying a visit to the Carvers who'd taken his daughter Bess while his mother Jessica was sick. He'd managed to survive an awkward lunch with his own family's lady folk a few hours prior. I'm surprised they liked the cheese so much, I said despite being distracted. I colored the family's home blue and struck through the list of associated names. It was my way of ensuring that we got everyone and no, or at least minimal, backtracking would be required. Are you joking? I wouldn't have given it up if I didn't know I could get more from you, Alim said in disbelief. He laughed then, helpless with mirth and thankfully alone for the moment. While chatting, I caught up drawing and coloring the map. As Alim moved, more details were revealed since he was in a section he hadn't visited before. It was kind of interesting to watch that happen. A new area blooming as he passed through. Alim had lived in the village for most of his life, but there were still bits of it he'd had nothing to do with. Side streets and homes he'd never walked by. Not a lot, it was a small place, but still enough that a quarter of the village had been undefined when he initially arrived. Is cheese a popular food or something? I asked. I associated enjoyment of cheese with snobby stuff like overly expensive charcuterie boards. Then again, I couldn't recall anything like food preferences, so maybe I'd liked it but not paying extra for someone sticking it on a wooden plank. It would be if it tasted like what you conjured up. Not to mention it being nicely preserved in those wax rinds, Alim explained. Hey? Dude, you had that cheese on you as part of your rations. I just upgraded it a bunch, I countered. It honestly didn't matter, but I felt like Alim might get weird ideas if he thought I could straight up create things from nothing. I could buy some stuff from my store, but most of the time, I needed a sample for mundane items. Seriously? I tried one of those, and they were nasty. Your magic truly is strange, Alim offered. I felt like he'd be shrugging if I could see him, but it was a voice-only call. Telling Tiller video calls could only happen in caves was a lie, but it was a lot safer overall. I really didn't want to find out how fast a pitchfork and torch mob could be assembled if someone saw me talking to Alim. It might have been expired or poorly made, I guess. Unfortunately, I don't really have a sense of taste, so I can't really help you there, I offered with a shrug. As you say, mistress, Alim replied wryly. He had a tendency to sound amused when I mentioned not having something typically considered human standard. A turn of events that didn't come up as often as one might assume based on our respective species. So, you rest up and try to smooth things over with Tiller and your mom until we acquire the pie. Tomorrow you've got a full slate of home visits to the sick to pull off and I'll need you sharp, I offered to needle him playfully. Alim groaned. Yes, mistress, he replied dully. When the call disconnected, I found myself at loose ends for a few minutes. Or for as long as I wanted until it was time for the pre-refresh final spending of the day. That was a ways off, but I'd been burning a lot of my normal busy work when the system was acting up. With no task convenient to hand, I thought about calling Henry, or more likely writing him. He hadn't responded to my reply yet, but I wasn't worried about it. Telling someone something and having to face them afterwards was hard in its own way. If he needed a couple of days, I wasn't going to freak out. Needing to clear my head and do something at least semi-productive, I decided to do something instead of existential wallowing. That led me back to my earlier issue but RoyalRoad to playing around with the appearance editor. Well, more like researching it carefully, then playing with it. Grateful for the distraction, I started examining every option and tooltip visible. It didn't take long for me to find a couple of interesting points. Firstly, the new appearance could be turned on or off like an illusion of life. Second, I could have more than one appearance but hadn't unlocked the slots for them as of yet. I pondered that but didn't really find myself drawn to it. I might eventually need a closet full of magic as hell designs, but one would likely do for the moment. Beyond all that, I'd only get one shot about designing it. No pressure. Still, until I hit the finalize option, I would be able to play around with whatever I fancied for days if I felt like it. Feeling a bit playful, I sent out a text describing my new ability and asking for suggestions. I didn't have any serious plans for what I might want to look like, so I figured it would be fun to let the dungeon denizens weigh in on the matter. With that done and something interesting to work on for a bit, I resumed reading my options. No sense in going in half-cocked after all. It was about 15 minutes later that I heard a strange clattering, like bone on stone. A sound I was all too familiar with. Chris came skidding into the main room of my palace of shadows, all bones and soggy clothes. Like he was trying to use himself as a drying rack. "Chris," I started. "Be a big-ass lava monster!" Chris shouted. I was going to reply, then closed my mouth. I ask for appearance suggestions and he comes running at top speed for that. Big-ass lava monster indeed. What exactly could one say to that kind of enthusiasm other than sigh dramatically in fond irritation? Chapter 97. Girl Talk. I got very little in the way of suggestions from the dungeon denizens about what I might choose for my new appearance, aside from Chris. I'd more or less expected that but had thought it would be fun to include them, and I wasn't wrong. However, instead of advice or suggestions, I found myself with a trickle of visitors who were curious about the process. "Mistress. Unless you intended to alter a number of levels," Dawn faltered. She'd come to visit me after she and her team had done a walkthrough of some of the new construction on the stub layers. I wasn't doing official run-throughs yet, but it wasn't odd for them to take a stroll and see what was going on. She'd been sipping chaos while we discussed the various species for the past hour. It was pretty fun, but the current option had her looking uneasy. "I'm not feeling the mermaid either. I was just curious about what it would even look like," I said, gesturing at my double. Well, the mannequin that served to show how I'd look after alterations. It mirrored my gesture. When I'd seen the species on the list, I'd conjured images of Hans Christian Andersen's version. The one we were looking at didn't bear much resemblance. The humanoid top half was still scaled but had large solid black eyes and fins rather than hair. As a tropical variant, it was colored brilliantly in blues with electric yellow spots. "Can't say I want to redo the dungeon with a giant aquatic section either," I added, giving her a shoulder pat. "Maybe I'd even put in a lake or something eventually, but it wasn't going to be a dominant theme." "I'm relieved," Dawn said and chuckled. "Not a fan of swimming?" I asked in amusement. "It wasn't something that we did where I'm from," Dawn said, offering a shrug. I shrugged back. It was pretty standard where I was from but not universal. "If you'll excuse me," Dawn added, getting up from the couch. "Have fun on your date," I said casually. Dawn looked back at me sharply, then away before nodding. It wasn't like it was a secret that she and Icarus were together, but she still seemed surprised when I'd bring it up casually. On my own I gave up on playing with my possible appearance and got back to work. Refresh, and the night passed quickly like that. Alim would call in once he was ready to get back to work on our project. "Good morning, 42. Mina's voice echoed in the room. I gave a start but then went over and retrieved the communication stone we used. While I was doing that I peeked into the safe zone they occupied and found that Andrea was still asleep. "Good morning," I answered. We hadn't talked much since the chicken incident, so I was curious about what she wanted first thing. My guess was breakfast, but I felt a little uneasy. She normally ordered her meals with Andrea now. "So, can we talk a bit?" "About things," Mina said, hiding nerves under a smile. "You should wait for Andrea," I said. I didn't want to make things more awkward by double-dealing. "Right, and I will. Only, this is something Andrea won't understand," Mina said. It was astonishing how she managed to agree with me and then void that agreement in under 12 words. "Okay," I said after a moment. I was reluctant but decided to hear her out. I could always bring up any points she raised later if needed. "Thanks. So, this world is weird, like really weird. They don't have any adventurers guilds, and the churches are like, cookie cutter? I'd say it's like McPhee's chicken, but I don't think you have that," Mina said. She turned introspective. I wasn't sure if she was planning her words or trying to think of possible crossover brands between our worlds. Mysterious was the mind of a teenager. So, the churches are set up in an unnaturally similar fashion? I asked. I wasn't pressed for time, but I wanted to keep her on track if possible. This sounded like it might be important. Exactly. Even across different religions and outside of Stromholt. It's super not right, Mina agreed. The designs should change outside of stuff like which god the statues are for. But, I mean, the number of windows and everything is always the same, Mina continued. I found myself nodding. That would be weird and irritate the shit out of me. Once I noticed, I'd have been counting windows and comparing floor plans. The only catch was that I wasn't sure if why it happened was unusual. Depending on what Mina meant by churches, there could very well be a mundane explanation. It's not impossible for simple designs to be similar like that. Were the decorations alike? That's where you should see a fair amount of difference based on craftsmen and funds, I said. Unfortunately, I wasn't up on architecture enough to offer something more solid. My understanding of the subject amounted to random trivia. Things like knowing what a flying buttress was, 4 column types, but nothing substantial. I couldn't tell you what time periods they were used in or how most elements fit together. Yeah, that's the thing. They were pretty much the same and really inappropriate in some places. Like cherubs without anyone knowing what a cherub is. They even have popes in a polytheistic society. It's strange, Mina explained. I found myself nodding along in agreement again. A pope and cherubs? It sounds like someone from a different world got involved, I said unhappily. The world itself had its own gods and aesthetics. I could understand wanting familiar things or playing around to customize existing ones. Outright copy-pasting felt wrong to me and lazy. Then again, I didn't have strong feelings about my old world. Homesickness might have been a genuine problem for others. It might make someone want to remake this one to match theirs. Right? But then you have none of the stuff you'd expect. You get all that but like no Adventurers Guild or penicillin. So it feels uneven to me, Mina continued. I could see why she hadn't thought Andrea would understand. That aside, this conversation probably would have made her deeply uncomfortable. Even if Andrea accepted summoned heroes as a concept, that didn't mean she'd enjoy understanding how much they might have changed things, particularly since this didn't seem like a case where it was for the better. It might be that those things were introduced but didn't survive for some reason. It wouldn't be weird for some communities to be wiped out or crippled by natural disasters or disease. I paused. My issue with Blue Veins and Dr. Satan came to mind. The guy sounded like a 14-year-old douchebag playing Outbreak. I'd let that color my view of his threat potential, which I realized was a mistake. Being obnoxious didn't mean he had no strategic planning ability. I also hadn't been thinking about its broader implication. It was entirely possible to use disasters to influence, if not outright edit, a culture. Even if he wasn't doing that, other dungeons might conspire to affect the world around them in subtle ways. Okay, but I want an Adventurers Guild and cool churches. Like majestic ones with hot priests and cool priestesses, Mina said despondently. I felt like I was getting a glimpse into her favorite kind of NPCs. I can get behind that, but did you have a specific reason for bringing this up to me? Or is this just a chat? I asked. This might have just been her venting, but it was possible she expected more. It's nice to have someone to talk to who's similar. I mean, if you can hook me up with a hot glasses Oni-san priest, I'd much appreciate it. I'm not expecting it, though, so no pressure, Mina said, then laughed. Ah, well. I'll see what I can do. I offered half-heartedly. I wasn't planning to get into matchmaking. Still, I felt a vague curiosity about if someone who fit her description even existed. Okay. Oh, Andrea's starting to wake up. Talk to you later. Mina said brightly. She put her stone away and I did the same. I hadn't known what to expect when the conversation started and was now totally adrift. Instead of stewing right off, I ducked into my chamber of machinations and wrote down some notes on what we'd discussed. I had no way at present to confirm anything she'd said, but it was worth keeping in mind going forward. I had no idea what I'd do if it was true though. An incoming call from Alim put my head back in the correct space for the day. We had a village to help, and that took precedence over vague possible conspiracies. Chapter 98. That old familiar feeling. With my discussion with Mina fresh on my mind, I considered what to do about the pair at the farmhouse. Myra and Heta had been enjoying a couple of days of peace to themselves, but it was time that I started making a legitimate effort to make a deal. Myra and Heta, I hope you've found the farm comfortable and have been able to rest. This evening I would like to speak with you more directly. I know little about either one of you and would like to correct that. Please turn out the lights after dinner if you agree to hear me out. Regards. 42. The message was probably too simple, but it would have to do. It would have been easier to give them a communication stone sealed in a letter, but I felt a bit theatrical. It might help things go smoothly if I gave them a relatively non-threatening display of my powers. Coming across as friendly was good, but I couldn't make a contract without giving away what I was. Since I couldn't get around the reveal, I might as well try and make it work in my favor. With that in mind, I started messing around with some environmental effects when I took breaks. I'd been working steadily to fill out the stub layers and had made decent progress. It would probably only be about 2 weeks until I felt comfortable taking a couple of days off to do the Illusion of Life upgrade. I checked my day's allotment of mana with that on my mind. With plenty to spare, I decided some additional testing was in order. I texted Dawn and invited her to be my test guinea pig skeleton along with Icarus. It didn't take long for the pair to appear in the lounge. My end of the process was simple enough. I just paid for the needed upgrades and enabled the Illusion of Life to add on. Gold sparks shimmered around Dawn for a moment while Icarus's were violet, both matching their eyes. Nothing else happened since they both needed to select their appearances and enable them. Don't forget, if you find it uncomfortable, you can disable your illusion, I reminded them. Chris had been turning his on and off at seeming random along with modifying it. He liked to keep his appearance rough, but he waffled about which horrific details he wanted to take. Something I wasn't about to get involved in for the moment. Mistress, are there any rules or concerns I should be aware of? Dawn asked. Just that there will be a waiting period to change things once people enter the valley, I replied, a brow raising. Technically, until we had people in the valley and were carrying on some kind of charade, it didn't matter if he messed with his looks. He'd agreed to stop once that happened, and I was resolved to put my foot down on the matter. No sense in letting a plan be ruined by carelessness. I can take a look if you are worried about something specific, I added. Dawn nodded, and I went over to her side. Icarus eyed us both curiously but didn't say anything, intent on his appearance. So, as you can see, Dawn said, gesturing. I found myself looking at a woman who seemed like she'd been in her mid-30s. She had a single gold tooth, missing eye, broken nose that healed wrong, and a random smattering of scars. That was in addition to an extensive amount of tattooing and what I suspected were holes for piercings. Dawn definitely would have looked grim before I'd seen how Chris originally looked. By comparison, she seemed to have a fairly easy time of things. She might even have been rather fashionable if I got the chance to see her fully decked out. I'm not going to question you if you want to leave the damage. I mean, I can make you a gold tooth instead of depending on the illusion if that's something you'd like, I offered. I'd noticed a gap but hadn't considered if it had been filled in life or not. I also didn't know if she'd lost it, chosen to remove it, or her corpse had been robbed. You don't see an issue? Dawn asked. From across the room, Icarus snorted. Dawn looked over sharply to glare at him, her jewels flaring. No. I said, feeling lost. I looked over the image of her again in case I'd missed something. I could make you a glass eye or something too if you'd like. I'm not sure what would happen if we removed one of your jewels. Maybe we could put it inside. I mused. It wouldn't take much for me to make a sweet-looking prosthetic or eye patch. You're serious? Dawn asked, clearly not believing me. She's from some daft place where they think women who look like her are demons and tattoos are evil, Icarus chimed in. Seriously? Well, I'm not from there, and I don't give a fuck what they think. Make yourself look how you want, I told Dawn firmly. Seriously, people who had a problem with someone for aesthetic reasons could go fuck themselves with a knife. Though she looked reluctant, Dawn nodded and turned back to her task. Not surprisingly, Icarus was the first to finish. He was wearing a simple tunic with pants and boots. When his illusion activated, he looked odd to me for the first few moments. I'd seen images of how living halflings looked but not one in the flesh, illusory though it was. Looking at Icarus, I felt like there was an almost cat-like element to his features. He had brown hair cut to a medium length and an impressive set of mutton chops to go with his goatee. With how his hair behaved, or rather refused to, it gave him a lionish appearance. Icarus also seemed to be faintly smiling thanks to a nasty scar that pulled up the left side of his face a bit. I'd never really had an image in my head of what he'd look like living, but this felt correct on some level. He also seemed rather pleased with himself as he inspected his form in the mirror I'd had sitting around since I first added it. Finally, Dawn was ready, and she stepped up to the mirror before activating it. She was wearing a simple red dress. I got the feeling they'd both begged something ready-made off Henry and ended up with things hardly begun by his standards. A moment later, the force field effect that created the physical bulk of a living body brought a tearing sound. Dawn was about 6.5 feet tall but not thin. Her body was solidly muscled, and the dress tore at the shoulder on the left side and right through the hips. Oh! Dawn looked down. She regarded the dress with a fascinated kind of horror. I felt terrible that it was taking away from her moment. You look stunning, I said immediately, and I meant it. Dawn had a dark complexion, and her cloud-like coily hair was a dark chocolate brown with a complicated mixture of red and blonde highlights. Dawn's gaze snapped to me, full of uncertainty for a moment before an appreciative whistle had us both looking at Icarus. You look very much the wolf, Icarus said with a grin. Dawn looked flustered but not unhappy as he came forward to kiss her hand quite gallantly. They both froze. What's wrong? I asked, immediately on alert. Unfortunately, Chris was worse than useless when it came to finding anything out about the user experience. I can feel her, Icarus said immediately. Right. Do you mean differently from normal? I asked, feeling lost. The skeletons had a basic sense of touch more than I used to have. She feels like a mortal, Icarus managed to get out. He was staring at Dawn, who was looking down at their joined hands. Not sure what Icarus meant, I decided to go with the fuck around find out method and put a hand on Dawn's shoulder. I snatched my hand back like it had been burned. I could feel skin, texture, and temperature. I'd expected the illusion to give a basic kind of feeling but not that I'd be able to experience it so profoundly. This was like having a human normal sense of touch back. I immediately poked Icarus in the chop and found I could feel the hair too. Oh, shit, I said flatly, entirely overwhelmed. Chapter 99. Overture. Myra and Heta shared dinner from the preserved food in the farm's pantry when evening came. They both sat silent for a spell when they finished, considering the hermit's letter. They'd expected to eventually meet them or be given some kind of request in exchange for their stay. The fact they'd been asked to put out the lights more than odd gave them both pause. Are we going to do this? Heta asked. I could ask for an oracle, Myra said without much conviction. Eula wasn't stingy, but there was always a price to pay if it wasn't offered freely. At the moment, they lacked the preferred offerings, which meant one of them would have to bleed for it. No. I supposed it should be enough that we're both free. If this hermit wanted to harm us, all they had to do was leave us as we were, Heta said and sighed. She was naturally of a mildly paranoid disposition. Most Lepusan were. It didn't make them cowards, but flight usually kicked in well before flight. She preferred to scout and study something until she felt confident rather than walk into it blind. Though how that came about is still a question, Myra said, sighing with her own irritation. Rather than discuss it, Heta got up and started putting out the candles they'd lit. It didn't take long as they'd only used 3 in total. Heta would have only needed 1, but Myra disliked depending on her more than she had to, and her eyesight was too poor for such dim light. So what now? Wait for a knock? Heta asked. As if to answer her, a breeze kicked up and rapidly swelled to a howling wind. A window across the room blew open with a bang. That won't be necessary, a strange voice replied. Every hair on Heta's body stood up at the bizarre double-layered sound. Like 2 low-voiced women talking just slightly out of sync. Myra grabbing her in fright was all that kept her from charging the dark window and whoever was speaking. Good evening, I'm your benefactor and the owner of this valley. Please, call me 42, the woman continued. Heta swallowed, doing everything in her power to keep her frantic heartbeat under control. If she let it get any more out of hand, she'd either attack or blackout, and neither option was ideal. I'm Myra, and she's Heta, Myra offered, managing to keep her voice even through force of will. Hermit, Heta growled. Myra looked up in alarm, realizing a little late that her lover had never mastered the fine art of sounding polite, even when she wanted to. A problem that was always made worse when she was under stress. Again, 42's fine, but I'll take Hermit if you're more comfortable with that, 42 said easily. Her voice was strange but sounded amused rather than offended. Myra let out a held breath in relief that she was apparently unfazed by Heta's lack of decorum. Why did you want the lights out? Heta asked bluntly. Myra wished she could kick her. Bold question, 42 muttered after a painfully long pause. It's fine, forget she asked, Myra said quickly. She tugged on Heta, who was standing like a marble figure, locked up in a contest with her instincts. Reluctantly Heta sat down next to her at the chair she'd used during dinner. Neither Myra nor Heta questioned that who they were talking to was the one who'd freed them. There was a strange heaviness in the air like the moments before a storm descended, a sense of power. They were in the presence of someone who could work such a miracle though they knew not how. I think we all have a lot of questions for each other, but I'd like to skip a few steps, 42 began. Myra felt her stomach drop, wondering if Heta hadn't succeeded in offending her despite her calm response. I could lie to you both, but I think that would fall apart rather quickly. So, I'm going to offer you a deal instead. First, you agree to keep my secrets. Second, I agree to allow you to leave unharmed should you decide to decline the rest of my offer. Fair? 42 asked. I guess, Heta said flatly. Myra gave her a pinch, wishing her lover would just fall silent if she couldn't engage her brain and her mouth at the same time. That sounds agreeable, Myra offered with forced cheer. They'd both been curious about the hermit but a little fearful too. Hermits weren't exactly rare, but they weren't easy to meet either. It was in the definition of their title. They would separate themselves from society at large and hole up in secluded places. Still, they'd both heard of a few of such people. Their reputations were always odd at best and downright alarming most of the time. Some hermits were known to carry on strange religious of dead gods or follow heretical practices for living ones. That wasn't even counting the reasons that drove them to live in such a peculiar manner. Disfigurement, disease, curses, a revelation of unnatural heritages, not pleasant causes. Myra felt it was likely best to respect the hermit's privacy measures given all of that. On the other hand, Heta was trying very hard not to give in to instinct and pick Myra up and leg it for the desert. Well, then pardon the theatrics, 42 said. A moment later, a glowing panel of text appeared before each woman. As you can see, I want a bit more than a verbal promise, 42 added. Myra and Heta were both stunned for several long moments as they looked at the floating text. They'd never encountered anything quite like it outside of a grand oracle, and neither was sure it was quite the same. Unfortunately, only the head of the tower was allowed to be close enough to read Eula's words directly. "Take your time, both of you. I'm not in a hurry, and you should give this matter due consideration," 42 said. Myra looked toward the sound of the voice, wishing she could see the speaker. Time passed, and eventually, Heta nudged Myra, totally at a loss. Should I sign it?" Heta asked. Her voice cracked a little with fear. All of the fight had gone out of her the moment the panel had appeared. Myra considered for a few moments longer before giving up. "Yes, I'm going to," Myra said simply. They didn't have much in the way of an alternative, and 42 wasn't asking for much. They both agreed to the terms of the contract and were treated to the disturbing sound of 42 sighing. "Awesome, thank you both," 42 said, relieved. "How did you free us from our enslavement?" Heta asked, voice soft and quaking. "Oh, I had a friend take the items off the both of you," 42 replied. The hesitation struck Myra and Heta as odd, but they didn't question it. The person who'd done so had likely perished despite accomplishing the task. "My turn. I noticed you two are a couple, which is a rather unconventional given the circumstances," 42 started. "Mind telling me how you two got together?" 42 asked. Myra and Heta were left wrong-footed by the mundane question. "I was captain of the Sears Tower's guard before the chaining. We were already lovers, and she bought me afterward as a personal guard to keep me from being auctioned to strangers," Heta said bluntly. "Oh, fuck. What's the chaining?" 42 asked, sounding startled. "It was when all demi-humans were declared slaves in Stromhold and its territories," Heta answered. "Oh," 42 responded weakly. "The solution wasn't ideal, but the living can't remove enslavement items. I received an oracle that only the hands of the dead could, which is why Heta was so concerned about that part," Myra offered, hoping to smooth things over a bit. It was an awkward dovetail, but it wasn't a moment where she could summon much eloquence. "Well, Heta, if I can call you that. Do you prefer demi-human as a term? I'd understood it as you're a Lepusan, and the collective term for non-humans is Ladaran, was I wrong?" 42 asked. Myra's mouth opened in a little O of surprise before closing. Either 42 didn't care, or that was an incredibly graceless pivot of topics. "I know my kind are Lepusan, but I've never heard the word Ladaran before," Heta replied. "Myra, have you?" Heta asked. "I've only run across it in ancient manuscripts a few times," Myra confirmed, feeling numb. "It means children of Laral. The races who don't claim a specific patron apparently used it at one time," Myra clarified. That information had come from the oldest of the tomes the tower held. Ones that dated from before the era of myths. Myra's mind worked feverishly to find an explanation. Thankfully one was baked in, and she latched onto it before her brain overheated. 42 had called herself the Hermit of the Laral Mountains. Perhaps it was knowledge she'd received as a revelation or through some book passed down among hermits. Mystic schools did something like that. So it stood to reason that hermits might inherit something from predecessors. "I definitely like those words better than demi-human," Heta offered, seeming relieved. "Noted," 42 replied. There was a rather protracted silence. "Right, your turn to ask a question," 42 offered. "Is Reiner actually dead?" Myra asked. "Certainly, I mean, not simply trapped. Would you like to see the body?" 42 asked. That Myra started only to falter. "Yes," Heta said flatly. "Right, can't blame you for wanting to be certain. Did you want me to take care of him afterward? I'll understand if you'd rather he not get a proper burial given what happened," 42 replied. "He didn't do any of that by choice," Heta said quietly but with a fierceness in her voice. "I know, but I wasn't sure if you did. Also, it wouldn't be wrong not to forgive him anyway. You're entitled to your own feelings, 42 said gently. He was like a younger brother to Heta, but the Church of Stamhold took him a few years before the chaining. They claimed he was a chosen hero. Lily went along with him to learn healing and support him, Myra explained. 42 might know that Reiner was controlled, but that didn't mean she knew anything about the boy himself. As lightly as she felt her guilt for her role in his death, Myra still wanted 42 to understand he wasn't a bad person when he had a choice. He was greedy and a little dumb, but he meant well, Heta added sadly. Rain had incredible patience when lining up a shot and absolutely none for anything else. A fact that had got him into trouble more often than not. I'm sorry for your loss, 42 said softly. I'll give both Reiner and Lillian to you for whatever funerary rites are appropriate. Just let me know what you need, 42 added. Thank you. They were both good friends of ours until everything went wrong, Myra said sadly. Reiner and Lillian had grown up at the same orphanage until Reiner went to the tower to train. Despite that, Lillian had made a point of coming around as much as she could. She'd been well liked for her foul-mouthed cheerfulness. Right. Okay, let's call it here for tonight. I feel like you need some time to adjust, 42 said, sounding concerned. I'll leave you a map of where you can find the bodies in the morning. Thank you, Heta said sincerely. Should we pin the list for what we need for the rites after you go, or would you like to hear it now? Myra asked. You can tell me now. Or if you need some time to think, I'll leave you a communication stone. You'll be able to speak with me anytime from anywhere with it, 42 replied. Wait, what? Myra asked. It's a neat bit of magic imbued on a stone. All you have to do is hold it to activate it, 42 explained. Thank you for your benevolence, Myra said, voice openly shaking. Myra's mouth went dry. Heta couldn't see it, but she'd turned pale in the dark. That was a magic item of a caliber rarely seen, much like the light stone that a peasant had used to lure them to the valley. Chapter 100. 21 Questions. The morning after their first direct contact with 42, the valley was quiet, almost peaceful. Myra and Heta woke to find what they'd asked for to conduct funerary rites waiting for them. Given the short notice, it wouldn't have been strange if some were missing or of poor quality. Instead, the materials were, if anything, better than they'd have expected. More so even than if they'd had time to buy them themselves. Likewise, following the map, they easily found the small cave in which Reiner and Lillian's bodies had been stored. Seeing they were safe, Myra and Heta left them in the cold space for the time being and focused on getting ready. Everything came together neatly and before noon they had the pyre ready, though the actual burning would wait until dusk. Love, you all right? Heta asked. It wasn't strange for them to pass a morning in silence, but Myra smelled ill at ease to her. Something that seemed less and less likely to be because of what they were doing as the day wore on. I'm just thinking about 42 and what she might want to offer us, Myra replied. Heta's ears stood to attention in surprise. It wasn't as if she'd forgotten, but it definitely had been the farthest thing from her mind. Ah, well, I think we'll know soon enough, Heta said with a half-hearted shrug. It wasn't as if she wouldn't like to know, but she didn't think she could guess and didn't bother trying. Ha, true, Myra agreed, sighing. Cha-cha, if I want to leave, even before we finish this, she gestured at the pyre, would you? You say it, and we leave, Heta replied without hesitation. She didn't like hearing Myra sound scared, but it was a bit reassuring to know she did have some fears about what might come to pass. It was also nice to hear the old nickname. She hadn't since the chaining. Okay. I don't think we need to. I think I just wanted to hear you say it, Myra said and laughed. Mimi, I go where you go, Heta said simply. I think I'm going to rest here a while and stew on my thoughts, Myra said. She'd found a nice cool spot to sit in near the pyres. Heta wasn't surprised she needed a break. They traveled a lot, but always on horses, with Myra not doing any of the labors related to camping. Her eyesight made it too much of a tricky business in any but broad daylight. "All right, love, I'm going to look around a bit," Heta said and got a nod. In contrast to her lover, she was high energy, and the fact she'd been made to keep up with horses on foot hadn't been a problem. Most of the time anyway. Walking along the wall of the valley, Heta passed the cave where Reiner and Lillian were and headed closer to the mountain. Here the stone started to form paths, but nothing so complicated as the stone labyrinth at its entrance. Heta explored it without fear of getting lost, knowing she'd be able to trace her own scent and leaving a few markers where she felt it was warranted. It didn't take her long to find what was probably the mine entrance. She eyed it curiously, but didn't make a move to explore it. Even if 42 hadn't warned them off it, she could smell something strange coming from it. Like the valley, too much life and a heavy element of mana to it. Continuing onward, Heta found what looked like a broken staircase peeking from behind a rock slide. Curious, she bounded over the stones to get a look. She found it continued up for a ways, broken stone statues of strange horses lining it. Jumping down, she followed it up to a plaza. Heta's breath caught. The fountain was taller than she was, with 3 tiers from which water flowed lazily from the pomegranate at its apex. She'd never seen anything quite so lovely and walked around its perimeter as she studied it. That was when the carving caught her attention. Twice Heta's height, she should have seen it right off, but had been distracted by the fountain. Walking up to it, she found it seemed bizarrely familiar, despite not having seen anything like it before. After a few moments, she realized why. The carved panels were depicting a story she knew by heart, despite having lost her Lupson family early. It was the story of Laurel represented larger than life. Knowing only crude idols or the occasional carved pendant, it was beyond her ability to imagine who might have created it. Without consciously deciding to, Heta reached out to touch the central image. Laurel with her spear driven into the head of her eternal enemy. Heta's heart skipped a beat or 10 as the panel seemed to split and fall back. Thinking she'd broken it, tears welled up until it finally registered in her overwrought mind the panels were swinging back too smoothly to be ruined. What she'd laid her hand on wasn't a solid piece of stone but a door. Within, Heta found herself passing through a short tunnel and into a large chamber full of the sound of flowing water. Before her was another fountain, this one featuring a towering figure. Laurel, with her spear brandished and a fearsome expression meeting the serpent in combat. Seized by an unfamiliar feeling, Heta fell to her knees, then outright fainted. When she awoke, Heta found her side hurt rather abominably, more so than any other part of her. Rolling over, she found she'd passed out on a slim book that had dug into her ribs. Feeling barely coherent, she thoughtlessly put it in her belt pouch and got up. She needed to tell Myra about this. After relating the story and showing the temple to Myra, they retreated to the farmhouse to wait out the hours until it was time to light the pyres. They didn't talk much, Myra's mood growing heavier while Heta was filled with a deep agitation. If they didn't have other things to do, she'd have gone back, probably slept in the holy space. "Tonight, after the funeral, I want to talk to 42 and make a deal," Heta said once her agitation reached its peak. Myra didn't respond right away, but it didn't put her lover off. She was human and Heta was Lepusan, it wasn't unexpected she'd have less of a reaction to Laurel. "Would you still want to if 42 was the one who lured us here?" Myra asked finally. "Did you have a revelation?" Heta asked. "No, but the communication stone, it's like the light stone. It seems simple, but it is intricately made and powerful. I've never even heard of a magic item that didn't need to recharge or didn't break after so much use, no matter how minor the effect was," Myra explained. Heta nodded in agreement, she hadn't either. Magic items were rare in the first place and usually fragile or of limited use from what little she knew of them. "Still doesn't prove anything," Heta pointed out. It wasn't that she doubted Myra had a reason for the question, but that she wanted to hear it said plainly. A process she was an old hand at helping with, having to tease out a truth from Myra's mind that was as yet only half-formed. I know, and I've got nothing but suspicions. Everything about the story the man in the bar told Reiner seemed off, and the map was too high quality, Myra began. I'm going to ask 42 about it and see how she answers. I just want to know if what she says will matter to you or not, Bun, Myra finished. Heta opened her mouth to answer then closed it. She honestly wasn't sure and understood how that was problematic. I go where you go, Heta said finally. She might not care what 42 told them, even if it was horrible, but she wouldn't be parted from Myra. That much was unchanged. All right, Myra said and they embraced. Bringing Lillian and Reiner's bodies down to the pyre was easy enough and as sunset fell, Myra and Heta said some words and lit them. They hadn't even discussed the idea of doing any of the rites of Stromholt. That god was dead to them both and they doubted Reiner or Lillian would have wished for it once they were free. Instead, they used the older way of it, one that didn't see much use except when dealing with the bodies of strangers. A few kind words for the dead, a beseeching to the gods of good to look after them, and then some drinking as they watched the pyre burn down. Between the dry wood 42 had supplied and a calm windless night, Myra and Heta were able to watch in relative comfort. It was not until nearly dawn the matter was finally done. We can wait to speak with her, Heta offered. Myra had gotten the communication stone in its little leather pouch out, but hadn't opened it. Will it change anything if we do? Myra countered. Heta shook her head. The only thing that could would be to learn something new. Myra took the stone out. 42, we're ready to speak if you have the time, Myra said. I certainly do, 42 replied after only a short pause. You said something about a deal before, Heta prompted. I did, but I also said I'd answer your questions once you agreed to keep my secrets. So, let's start with that. It wouldn't be a good idea to build a partnership on uncertainty, 42 countered. Did you lure us here using the man from the bar? He had a light stone and map, Myra asked immediately. That was Alim, and not specifically, but yes. I asked him to send people here and he sensed you were a threat to his companion, a woman named Tiller, 42 answered bluntly. Why? Do you work for the dungeon's master? Myra asked. Heta's breath caught. She hadn't considered anything of the sort. No, 42 replied, sounding shocked. Heta felt a deep sense of relief. Would you allow people to come here? Would you allow them to visit the temple? Heta asked, unable to wait. Certainly, I'd actually hoped people would want to live here, 42 replied, but her tone was off. She sounded surprised, like something had caught her off guard. Why? Myra asked. Well, my idea is to build a community. One where adventurers can come and stay while they challenge the dungeon. It's got enough monsters, gatherable materials, and rewards that I think it could support a sizable town, 42 explained. Myra and Heta exchanged a confused look. So, you mean to coexist with it? Myra asked. In a manner of speaking, 42 said, still sounding like the conversation had her wrong-footed. Would you require all people who came here to challenge the dungeon? Heta asked, as something occurred to her. No? I mean, aside from adventurers, most people will be craftspeople and whatnot. It would be kind of insane to make that a requirement to live here, 42 replied. Would you welcome Laudaren? Heta asked. Yeah, I don't plan on discriminating against anyone, 42 replied. Myra? Heta asked, looking at her lover. She wasn't good with plans, though like now, she did get the occasional big idea. She'd need Myra to help her make any sort of plan and see it through. May we speak again tomorrow? Myra asked. They had much to talk about between themselves before they continued with 42. Heta's questions had caught Myra entirely off guard. Yeah, no problem. Have a good night, you two, 42 agreed. After a final pleasantry, Myra put away the communication stone, and Heta helped her up. Together they walked back to the farmhouse for some sleep, and a long talk once rested.